Ladies and gentlemen, today is December 20th, 2025, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, Godzilla, you name it, we'll talk about it. Another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith. Yo.
Hello?
Merry Christmas, how's it going?
Merry Christmas. It's going all right. How's your week been?
It's been a mixture of warmer than usual and 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's gone around temperature-wise. We did a bunch of hard work in fixing up the trees that fell from the 90-mile-per-hour winds. We lost 7 trees, which we can convert into firewood, which is good. That's a resource. One of the buildings on the property has a wood fire stove, or whatever it's called. Old thing that they built in the house. Probably, I think it was like 1916 they built this place. So it's over 100 years old. They were homesteaders who came out here, which you have different rights of the land if you homestead as opposed to, I don't know what the other type of ownership is. But normally the government or the state has the rights to, say, minerals underneath you. Mm-hmm. But if you have a homestead right to the property, then the mineral rights are yours. There's still certain things that belong to the state, like if you discover a cave network, I think that's theirs. And they have, I think, some rights to dictate where the forest land and stuff is. But yeah, it's been a pretty, I don't know, frontier week for me. We had power outage, so I was back in the Stone Age, and then we've been dealing with the aftermath of that. But it feels very satisfying when you complete the job and you see how much lumber you get. We got a ton. It was a pretty big tree that fell that we cleaned up. So we chop it into pieces with a chainsaw, and then you take those cylinder blocks and you put them on a wood splitter, and they have some really powerful gasoline ones that just punch right through it. So that's a really strong piece of equipment that breaks them into smaller wedges that you can then put in the fireplace. But when a tree is recently felled, it's got a lot of water content in it because it was just recently alive. And that doesn't burn very well at all. It'll just kind of smoke, and it's really hard to keep the fire going without adding some other catalyst like lighter fluid, which you don't really want to be constantly using that in your house. So we stack it up and then basically wait a year of just letting it dry out, letting it air out and stuff, and then it actually burns well. So the wood that we chopped up from this tree and the other trees can be used probably next winter.
Gotcha.
Yeah. I've had a good mixture of StarCraft and Dota in the past week when I have been able to stream. And yeah, we did have one request leading into this to see if you would talk about Godzilla for a little bit.
Talk about Godzilla. Any particular aspect of Godzilla?
That was the only element that was raised so far. If they're still here, you could give a more specific question, but yeah, that's one of your, I would say, like, side departments of information and knowledge that's way more than the average person. It's just your Godzilla lore understanding. And it's fiction, right? Normally you work in non-fiction, but some fiction is really good, and you want to figure out what's going on in it. I know more than the average person about Star Wars lore, because I played the Old Republic games. I haven't read a bunch of books, but there's a bit more exposure to that I have. So yeah, what about Godzilla? Is there anything new with Godzilla that's coming out that you know about?
They are making a sequel to -1. But that's still a ways off, probably.
I still have to see that.
It's good. I recommend it. By the way, as a quick tangent, you did successfully talk me into buying KOTOR. So
Awesome.
it is in my library.
Awesome, that's a very good game. The mechanics and game flow are quite similar to Baldur's Gate.
Oh, yeah?
It's turn-based, and you're managing your character and companions each turn. and deciding what they do. So
Really?
it ends up being a very similar game, just different lore and setting basically. You have a lot
Huh.
of character customization as well, so you can be more of like a spell casting Jedi or more of a lightsaber fighting focused Jedi, or you can focus on like using guns and stuff if you want to. There are a lot of different options for what kind of character you want to have, and the game doesn't really, I don't think it really favors one style over another. Like you can make any of them work at a pretty high difficulty setting. And the mechanic that I really like in it is an alignment tracker, where if you're good to people and you do the right thing, you get light side points and your alignment shifts more blue. And if you do evil stuff, you get dark side points and it shifts more red. And you get certain benefits or detriments whenever you have either extreme. But then you can also play the game as a gray character where you're not either good or bad. You kind of have like a more balanced take on stuff. So it ends up shaping the story, and in, I think it's just KOTOR 2, not the first one, but your companions end up being open to your influence as well. So you can change certain characters that maybe start out more dark side, and you can convince them to do the right thing, or vice versa, you could take a more good character and corrupt them. So very cool mechanics in that game.
I had no idea it was turn-based.
Yeah, I like the system a lot.
I just assumed it was, I don't know, isometric, I guess.
A lot of the Star Wars games that have a Jedi-focused main character, they are real-time, where you're kind of jumping and hacking and slashing through stuff, which can be fun. Did anyone play the old school game? It was called Obi-Wan. It was just the game about his sort of story, and you were fighting gangsters on the streets of Coruscant and stuff. That was a fun game. Would have been maybe on the first Xbox if I had to guess. So a while back.
Gotcha. I almost got the sequel too, but I figured it would be better to wait and see what I thought of the first one.
Yeah, I would say just play the first one. I suspect that you will like it, based on knowing other things that you like.
Gotcha. I look forward to it. It's on the list.
Mm-hmm.
I've been moving through it recently. Well, let's see. Godzilla. There is a lot of overlap between the fictional aspect of Godzilla and nonfiction. Generally, you can kind of track the cultural and political zeitgeist in Japan in a given era of Godzilla movies just by the underlying themes and commentary in the movies. Yeah, so like the obvious example is the first Godzilla movie, which is a commentary on nuclear weapons, the aftermath of World War II, war in general, all of which was very pertinent to post-war Japan. Going into the 60s, a little more commercial, but that speaks to the degree of prosperity in Japan in that period. I don't know, have you ever seen the original Godzilla versus King Kong?
No.
If you have time and you're so inclined, you might give it a try. It's not like a great movie, but if you do watch it, try to watch the Japanese version. A lot of the early Godzilla movies in the Showa era, like 50s, 60s, 70s, saw a lot of edits when they were moved over to the United States. So there's generally American and Japanese versions of those movies. And in the case of Godzilla versus King Kong, there was an especially large amount of editing done.
Why?
And why, in general, American companies had very little respect for American consumers. And so they very much went out of their way to edit out any substantive commentary or social critique that might be in the original Japanese versions. So the result is that a lot of Godzilla movies released in the United States in that period tended to be even more campy than their original Japanese versions. But in the case of Godzilla versus King Kong, the original Japanese version actually pretty heavily critiqued and made fun of capitalism, and perhaps more specifically Japanese commercialism, which was quite prominent at that time because, again, Japan was experiencing its economic miracle. It was rapidly growing and recovering from World War II. And there were a lot of people that were not especially comfortable with that, especially on the left, and some of the trade offs that the government was making, as well as just broader society. And so Godzilla versus King Kong, as weird as it might sound, kind of embodied a lot of those critiques with certain elements within its plot. And it was not like a serious critique. You know, the movie was very campy, even in the original Japanese version. You know, they kind of made light of it, but it was there. And it was not in the American version, very much so. So that's kind of an example. That's kind of an example of the sort of '60s in Godzilla films and in Japan generally. I would point out that not all of the films in the '60s were quite that socially minded. Some of them were goofy. Godzilla versus Ebirah, for example. That's the one where Godzilla fights a giant lobster. There's not a lot going on in that one. To be fair, that was actually originally intended to be a King Kong movie. It was originally going to be King Kong versus a giant lobster, and then they kind of changed it at the last minute. And you can kind of see the contours of that in the plot. You know, a lot of things in that movie make way more sense when you consider that it was originally supposed to be King Kong and not Godzilla in it. In the '70s, it was this dynamic that I'm talking about was much more explicit. So things like hippies, social progressivism, environmentalism, all of those featured pretty prominently in a number of movies at that time. Most notably, Godzilla versus the Smog Monster, which is the one that immediately comes to mind, also known as Godzilla versus Hedorah. So, as the name might imply, Godzilla basically fights pollution, which was a hot topic item in Japanese politics in the '70s, because after many decades of rapid economic growth, the weight of that economic growth on the environment was really starting to show. And the environmental movement in Japan really started to take off. So, unsurprisingly, there was one Godzilla movie where environmentalism was the central theme. And it's also notable just because there's a lot of just weird niche stuff from that era, like disco, drug use. Like, there's a lot of filming techniques that were prominent at the time featured in the movie as well. So just it was a very, very '70s movie. You know, Japan was a part of the West at that time, and so they experienced a lot of the cultural phenomena Western countries like the United States and Europe were experiencing as well. So environmentalism, hippies, etc., all of that was prominent in Japan at that time as well. And so you can kind of see that in Godzilla versus the Smog Monster in particular. On a less political note, one of the popular trends in Japan, as well as just the broader West in the '70s, was the spy thriller, or perhaps more accurately, the spy action movie. You know, James Bond films were very popular. Cold War themed stories were very popular, especially those about sort of cloak and dagger spying. And so there were a number of movies at that time in Japan, including Godzilla movies, that featured some degree of espionage or spying in them. I think it was Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla, where one of the characters was basically just a special agent working for the Japanese government who was trying to infiltrate a cohort of alien invaders who were setting up a front company. It was the '70s. They're all weird like that. But in that case, that spy element in the plot was not something unique to that movie. That was kind of a underlying theme to a lot of popular media content in Japan at the time. So then you get into the '80s, and there's only 2 Godzilla movies made in the '80s. And one of them was '89, so like right at the end. There was a long interregnum in Godzilla production after 1979 because the movies had basically stopped making money. It was not really that profitable, so Toho kind of retired Godzilla for about 10 years in order to kind of give the brand time to breathe, to recover, so to speak. And eventually, when they came back in '85, they kind of released a more serious iteration of Godzilla. Because in the '70s, in the Showa era, especially in the latter stages, it definitely got very campy and goofy. They were very obviously targeting children as a demographic. So with 85, Godzilla 1985, they were very much going for a more adult demographic. And so the underlying theme in 85 was more Cold War. And considering that the Cold War was definitely prominent in the news and in international affairs in the 1980s, with sort of the Reagan era escalation on the part of the United States and the Soviet adventure in Afghanistan, you can very much see sort of that conversation embodied in some of the themes in Godzilla 85. Godzilla 89 doesn't really fit with my argument here. That was actually a fan script. Toho actually had, I shit you not, a competition in which they accepted scripts from fans, and the winner was supposed to get their script adapted into a film. And Godzilla versus Biollante in '89 was that. That was originally written by a fan. They obviously touched it up before they made the movie, but technically that is basically just what would you call it? Again, just a fan script. There's some particular name for that online, but I forget what it is.
Yeah, it's free labor.
Yeah, free. That's a good way of putting it. So that was the 80s. The 90s was a little different. So in the case of the early 90s, you see some of that euphoria from the economic boom in Japan in the 1980s, which you didn't see so much in Godzilla 85 or Biollante. You definitely saw that embodied in the plot of Godzilla versus King Ghidorah, which I think was 1992, which was not roughly correspondent with the decline. They started making it, I think, either before or just during the big stock market, but I guess it was more like a real estate bust that marked the long period of stagnation that would define the 90s. So Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is not really a 90s movie. It's sort of residual 80s. And again, it really embodied the optimism of 80s Japan, the sense that Japan was on an upward trajectory, and that so long as they just kept going, they were going to end up being a dominant player in global affairs just by dint of their huge economy. Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is a very weird watch because it's a very goofy movie. It kind of bucked the trend of sort of quasi-realistic, darkly themed Godzilla movies that had been set by 85 and Biollante. It was much more campy. It involved time travel and a whole bunch of other weird shit. There was a time traveler from future Japan that comes back to help them deal with monsters, and she talks about how in the future Japan is a superpower. And I shit you not, this is a real line in the movie. She says that Japan buys Africa.
The whole continent.
I get the whole continent, I guess.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was very much kind of reflecting that optimistic tenor in Japanese culture at that time. We're going to be a superpower someday. Didn't pan out. And later on in the 90s, the films kind of get increasingly vague in terms of their themes. They're not really as rooted in sort of the dominant cultural and political issues of the 90s. So like Mechagodzilla, Destroya, etc. Those don't really reflect the argument I'm making here. But it's not really surprising then that those movies also kind of marked the decline of 90s Godzilla. The Toho didn't really know what to do with the franchise, kind of running out of ideas, and the box office kind of reflected that. And so Godzilla 95, not Godzilla 90, Godzilla versus Destroyer in 1995 marked a period where they decided that they were going to take a pause. They had been releasing a movie roughly every 2 or 3 years for about 10 years, or 15 years, actually. Well, no, 10 years, up till that point. So they took a 5-year break, and then they made the first of the Millennium series of Godzilla movies, which were sort of these weird standalone B-movie iterations of Japan. And they were kind of cheapo, low budget. They did release them directly in theater, but they were not especially successful. So you could kind of consider that a reflection of stagnation era Japan. It wasn't really as optimistic a period. They were just kind of scraping by at that point. Once you get into, well, no, actually, there is a little bit in the aughts in this Millennium series a little bit of Japanese nationalism. And you can kind of consider this a reflection of the emergence, the ascendancy, I should say, of Shinzo Abe's faction in the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party in Japan. They had always been present in the coalition within the LDP that comprised the leadership of the LDP, but they'd kind of been secondary. They had not really filled a leadership role in the party until after the Cold War ended. And over the course of the period of stagnation in the 90s, they eventually emerged as the dominant faction. And so in the aughts, they become more nationalistic, increasingly so. And you see some of that reflected in these Millennium movies. There's a much more reverence for the Japanese military. The Japanese military is kind of in all Godzilla movies, but they're kind of background characters, but there's more reverence given to them in the Millennium series of movies. I remember in Godzilla Mothra King Ghidorah. That was the name of the movie. It was released in 2003, 2004. GMK. In that movie, there was even a scene where a Japanese journalist goes on like a short spiel about how great the JSDF is and how everybody should respect them. It kind of comes out of nowhere. It's weirdly out of place, and it kind of feels like political commentary. I don't know if it was the creator of the movie wanting to do that commentary. That may have been pressure from Toho. It's not necessarily uncommon in Japanese politics for the government to kind of lean on companies to adhere to a particular political line. And it wouldn't surprise me if that's what happened in the Millennium era. But regardless, you can see some of the era's nationalism reflected in the movies at that time. So after that, basically the pattern repeated. Toho noted that the movies weren't making as much money. And so they decided to do another 10-year pause, although before they did do one final Millennium movie called Godzilla Final Wars, which was pretty hilarious. The Millennium series is more experimental. They just kind of let directors kind of try new things, albeit on a very restricted budget. With Final Wars, they actually significantly upped the budget, and they basically just did a love letter to the Showa era. You know, the Showa era was all goofy and campy and just kind of, especially near the end, more about having fun, and that's what Final Wars was. It was a big budget, modern Showa era Godzilla movie. A lot of fans have mixed feelings about it, but I'm definitely in the pro camp. It's a very, very entertaining movie, so long as you don't take it too seriously. So after that, 10-year pause, 2004 to 2014 roughly, and then you get into the modern era, basically the Reiwa era. And Reiwa in Japan is all about experimentation. It's all about trying new things. And in America, it's more about traditional Godzilla. You know, the American MonsterVerse movies are more influenced by Showa era Godzilla than they are sort of the later iterations. So in the case of Shin Godzilla, that's probably the best representation of the argument I'm making here, because in Shin Godzilla, there's a number of references to actual political issues in Japan, not least of which was the Japanese government's response to the nuclear disaster at Fukushima. Just the overall critique of bureaucracy and the Japanese government being too top-heavy and not responsive enough. That ties into Fukushima, but also is just a general critique of the Japanese government, which has long suffered from those vices, so to speak. What was after that? Oh, Minus One. Minus One kind of is more of a critique of the imperial Japanese government, so that doesn't fit my argument as well. Shin Godzilla much better in that regard. But you can also consider that very political, in so much as it reflects sort of the Japanese left's anti-war politics. So Godzilla Minus One, in a sense, is a kind of rebuttal to the Millennium era nationalist Godzilla movies. And that pretty much brings us up to present day. I didn't really include the cartoons, you know, Singularity, or the trilogy. of CGI cartoon movies. I guess I should call them anime movies. That would be more accurate. Those were not especially political, though. Those were more hard sci-fi, almost. Especially Singularity. Although I appreciated that as a sci-fi fan myself. I thought it was really cool they were willing to experiment with that. But yeah, that's my sort of brief, truncated review of the intersection of Japanese politics and society in Godzilla movies. There's always a little bit of current events going on in any given Godzilla release, if you know where to look.
Seems like you could save a lot of time studying history. Just watch the Godzilla movie of the time, and you're like, okay, pretty good sense of what was going on.
Well, hopefully that sates the desire for Godzilla-themed conversation.
Good stuff.
Was there anything else you wanted to get to, or that anybody else wanted to get to?
Just random stuff that I heard about. There was a meeting between Trump and Putin, and Trump and Zelensky both.
Yeah. Where was that?
I think it was in Mar-a-Lago.
It wasn't Berlin. It was more recent. It was in the past couple days. Yeah, Zelensky and Trump met. And there was some snarky comments from Trump. Zelensky had been saying that he was more confident in the security commitments that the Trump administration had been talking about more recently and in private discussions. And Trump apparently didn't like that. And he went out of his way to say that there wouldn't be any deal until it had his permission. And then they met, and then they were kind of fine. Had a perfectly reasonable joint press conference, and things have been quiet since then. So I have no idea what they talked about. Generally, the pattern with Trump is that he tends to exhibit preference for the last people he talked to. He's been pretty consistent on that, bizarrely so. So presumably, if that holds for the next week or two, the Trump administration will be fairly amiable to Ukraine and Ukrainian interests. We'll see how long it lasts. I haven't seen any evidence one way or the other yet, but that's generally been the pattern. I haven't heard any details about what's been discussed, or if there's been any substantive change in the respective positions of Ukraine and the Trump administration. Supposedly, the Ukrainians have been pushing hard for better and harder security commitments, but the Trump administration has been pretty gun-shy about that since Trump came back into office. And the credibility of American threats on Ukraine is pretty weak right now. You know, Trump has proven pretty consistently that he really, really does not want to get directly involved. So until there's some kind of signal that there is a willingness to escalate to some degree, I don't think the Russians will be deterred from continuing the war or feel particularly incentivized to sign any kind of deal or ceasefire. I did have some Ukraine stuff around here. Oh yeah, one thing that happened with Ukraine is that Europe finally decided to seize Russian money and give some of it to Ukraine.
What money did they seize?
So basically, Russia had a bunch of assets in Europe, specifically financial assets that European governments froze as a part of sanctions, but did not seize. So there's been some discussion about whether or not to just seize them outright and either give them or loan them to Ukraine. And there was a week-long series of debates about it. And technically, they have not actually decided to fully seize the money. But they did agree to move forward with what I have in my notes as $90 billion loan to Ukraine. And that loan will not have to be paid back if Russia, what was it? The loan will only have to be paid back if Russia agrees to pay reparations. And if Russia doesn't, then The loan basically ceases to be a loan and becomes a grant, effectively.
Huh.
Yeah, but seized Russian assets are kind of implicitly behind the loan. You know, if they want to get their money back, they could just take those. Yeah, the Europeans have been very gun shy about just outright seizing the assets because they're concerned about retaliation and potential sabotage of peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, since obviously seizing the assets would be an escalation, and Russia may feel tempted to retaliate in some way, and certainly the money would be a part of any peace negotiation then. So the Europeans don't want to be on the hook for, you know, however many billions of dollars they might have to pay back to Russia if the negotiations for peace involve them returning seized assets that they spent on other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one could argue they would only improve their leverage if they just seized the money anyway and spent it, and then basically forced the Russians to accept it, because the Europeans, one could argue, cannot really credibly promise, given their financial straits, to return that amount of money if they did seize and spend it. But the Europeans don't seem to think like that. You know, they've been fairly risk averse on that question. Yeah, Europe has been trying to find money to help Ukraine since the United States cut aid this year. I was pretty dubious about whether or not the United States was actually cutting aid to Ukraine, especially earlier this year. I kind of assumed implicitly that it was just a headline, and that the money was probably continuing to flow, just more circuitously. But apparently, aid was actually substantively cut, and so Europe has had to significantly increase its own aid to Ukraine in order to compensate. There was some moving of money around, because a lot of the aid to Ukraine was actually in the form of increasing the defense industrial base in the United States, since we weren't really able to produce enough ammunition, especially artillery shells, to really fully support Ukraine. So there was a sense that money needed to be invested there. And in the early going, a lot of the money that was allocated to do that was technically allocated under Ukraine aid. And so it was generally included in headline numbers describing aid to Ukraine. Since Trump came back into office, they've stopped doing that. And now that's just a general item in the defense budget. So I don't think that money has decreased. In fact, if anything, it's probably been increased. So that fact that it's no longer sort of classified as Ukraine aid has artificially decreased the amount of Ukraine aid that the United States has been sending. However, even controlling for that, the overall amount of aid has significantly declined. And I wasn't entirely expecting that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's see. What else did I have here? I think we already talked about. Oh, no, this is kind of new. So the Ukrainian government did shift its position on territory. They've been pretty hard-nosed about the possibility of just giving Russia territory or withdrawing from territory or whatever it is Moscow and Washington are asking them to do in a given week. So more recently, there's been talk, especially after Putin met with Trump a couple weeks ago, about Ukraine withdrawing from Donbass and then having the territory they withdraw from become a demilitarized zone of some kind. The Ukrainians were very opposed to that. No, actually, it was originally Ukraine would withdraw from Donbass and then the Russians would just move in. That was the original. And now the Ukrainian position is that they would be willing to withdraw from Donbass, but only if the Russians did not move into the territory they withdrew from. That territory would become a demilitarized zone that would have international observers in it in order to ensure compliance by both Moscow and Kiev. They also want that territory to be a quote-unquote free economic zone, which would be policed and governed still by Ukraine. So the Ukrainian government would still technically control it, but they would not have military forces in it.
Interesting.
I suspect this is more about signaling to Washington a willingness to compromise more than it is a serious proposal. I suspect if pressed, they would probably be willing to do it, but I think this is a strategic move on their part, a strategic offer, so to speak, that is designed to both to placate Washington and to pressure Moscow, because Moscow is not going to want to agree to this. They have more maximalist aims in Donbass. So by doing this, they can kind of force the United States to look at Moscow and force Moscow in turn to disappoint them by refusing to agree to compromise on this, by refusing to accept this. And this is basically just part of the back and forth game that I predicted would happen at the beginning of the Trump administration this year, which is that both Moscow and Kiev would just kind of play the Trump administration by mostly maneuvering against each other. That is to say, Kiev and Moscow strategically making proposals and concessions and whatnot in order to make it seem to the Trump administration like they were giving concessions when really they were just trying to keep the Trump administration strung along, making them think that a compromise was close, but then moving the football at the last minute, Lucy style. That's pretty much what's been played out, what has played out, rather. And I expect that to continue. And I think the Trump administration kind of has boxed itself into this fate by being unwilling to really invest itself in the Ukrainian conflict. If you want one or the other player, and Moscow is the more important one here, if you want them to really change tack, the United States needs to increase its leverage. And the only way it can really do that is if it escalates to some degree, or at least signals a willingness to escalate. And the Trump administration doesn't want to do that. Probably its only significant leverage is its support to Ukraine, which it could threaten to cut, and which it has threatened to cut and has substantively cut in to varying degrees this year. But as we've seen, that has not resulted in de-escalation on the part of Moscow or an end to the war or progress in peace negotiations, because ultimately this is basically Moscow's war to end. It doesn't matter in that sense how much pressure you put on Ukraine. They're going to keep going regardless, because for them it's an existential conflict. So the Trump administration then just doesn't really have the willingness to actually increase its leverage to the point where it could end the conflict. And as a result, we sort of end up in these interminable, quote unquote, peace negotiations that never seem to go anywhere. It's not necessarily that different than the Biden administration in that regard. Biden kind of suffered similarly from risk aversion. But with Trump, it's even worse, because Trump has signaled that he very, very much does not want to escalate or really be involved at all. And the fact that he cut aid really underlines that. So, as much as the Biden administration waffled, the Trump administration has only undermined American leverage even further since then. So the American position on Ukraine continues to be ambiguous, damagingly so. So no change there, basically. More of the same. Oh, also, Vladimir Putin gave his annual television address. Have you heard of this?
Maybe? It's not ringing.
Yeah, he goes on to TV. He goes on TV at the end of the year, and he gives this marathon presentation where he takes questions from people, from callers, people in the audience, just kind of whomever. And he does it for like 3 or 4 hours. So it's a big annual event at this point. And sometimes he'll kind of go to bat for people. If somebody calls in with a problem, maybe he'll fix it. Whether or not that's performative or substantive is not entirely clear. But it entertains people. People appreciate him doing things for the little people in Russia.
Does he do things for tall people as well?
I don't know about that. He is pretty much the tall people in Russia, him and his patronage network. And he certainly does himself and that patronage network quite a few favors in any given year. So he doesn't really need a presentation to do that on television. but it was pretty much more of the usual. He did make one notable statement, which is that if the West were willing to respect Russia, then there would be peace. He very pointedly said that, Western fears that Russia might invade other countries were unfounded.
Even though you invaded other countries.
Yeah, but Ukraine is in the Russian mind, and especially Putin's mind, a special case. That's the Russian sphere of influence from their perspective. So his argument seems to be that if the West would just recognize Russia's sovereignty and special rights in the region, then everything would be fine. They could come to some kind of concord and relations could return to normal. I don't think it's an especially credible promise, because even before the invasion of Ukraine, it's not as though Russia was not misbehaving. There's any amount of espionage going on, both in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. I very specifically remember the polonium assassinations, which should have earned a much stronger rebuke from the West than what they ended up dispensing. So that's your Ukraine update for the episode.
Yes, thank you.
I don't know, did we talk about the shootings at all?
Where?
There was one in the US at a university, and there was another one in Australia. Not ringing any bells?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, the one in the US was at Brown University. There were 2 students killed, 9 injured. Basically, a gunman just ran into a university building, into a room where I think students were taking a test during final exams, and sprayed the room, did the damage, and then left. Also, it came out later that he'd apparently killed a professor a little bit earlier, before the shooting. The weird thing is that they didn't catch him for a week. Normally, shootings like that are resolved relatively quickly, either with the death of the gunman or his capture in short order. But in this case, he just kind of walked away and disappeared for 7 days. They eventually did find him, but they found him dead. He'd apparently died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. So that wrapped up the case relatively neatly. He was an immigrant on a visa. I think it was a green card, something to that effect. And the Trump administration responded to that with all of the tact that you would expect of them. They actually announced that they're going to temporarily suspend the green card lottery. And as far as I know, that suspension is ongoing. So that was the shooting in the US. The one in Australia was more higher profile. That was the Bondi Beach shooting. This one targeted a Jewish festival, I think is what it was. I don't think it was a holiday, but basically there was a festival of Jews in Australia where they all kind of got together at Bondi Beach and were having a thing. And they were targeted by a father and son pairing, weirdly enough. I think this is the first time I've heard of a mass shooting of this style, anyway, that involves a father and son pairing. These 2, I think, were South Asian, if I'm not mistaken. Supposedly, they traveled to the Philippines sometime in the previous weeks, in the weeks leading up to the shooting. But it's not clear if that's relevant yet. There's some rumors that they may have gotten training or been radicalized, but for now, the details are a little sparse, since it's still relatively recent. But apparently these guys headed in for Jews in particular, whether that was motivated by the conflict in Israel or just general anti-Semitism or some kind of jihadi sentiment. I'm not privy to that. There may have been updates since the shooting that I'm not aware of. But regardless, they were very purposely targeting Jews, and they ended up killing a good number, since it was fairly crowded at the beach when they opened up. One of them was shot dead. I think the other one was wounded and was taken into custody. They were almost disarmed before that. There was actually a passerby that successfully disarmed one of the gunmen. But then the other gunman shot them dead, unfortunately. So kudos for the effort. That took some balls, but unfortunately it didn't work out for them. But ultimately they were, well, one of them was captured, the other killed, and as far as I know, the investigation into sort of the lead up and background of the shooting is ongoing. But that was definitely big news when it happened. Let's see. There's been more protests in Bangladesh. I think we might have talked briefly about that last time.
What are they protesting?
So you remember that the government was, I don't want to say overthrown per se, but the government fell as a result of mass protests more than a year ago. And since then, they've had an interim government that's been trying to reorganize the government and prepare for new elections. Now, what happened recently is that one of the young leaders of the mass protests from a year ago ended up dying in police custody. And that had people very upset. So that's what initiated the mass protests recently. More recent, well, I shouldn't say more recently. In the past week, what happened is escalation. So over the course of the recent mass protests against the interim government, on account of the death of this protest leader, there was a mob that formed and targeted a Hindu man in Bangladesh. Bangladesh actually does retain a very small Hindu minority, so there are a few still around. This mob targeted a Hindu man, allegedly for being complicit in the death of the protest leader, and also for, quote-unquote, insulting the Prophet Muhammad. It's a not uncommon allegation for mobs in Bangladesh to levy when they want to kill somebody. So they lynched this guy. He was killed very publicly, and the result is that Indian nationalists, specifically Hindu supremacists, were incensed, and they've been mobilizing and protesting in front of the Bangladeshi embassy in New Delhi. So some people were talking about potential escalation between the two countries, potentially involving intervention by India. That was all hyperbole, or hyperbole, rather. The Indian government doesn't really care all that much. It doesn't really appreciate the decline, so to speak, in India's image in Bangladesh. A lot of Bangladeshi protesters, as well as just people in general, have kind of a negative opinion of India at this point because of India's alleged complicity in maintaining the, shall we say, the dictatorship under the Awami League that de facto existed for the past 10 years. It was never really a full dictatorship, but it was a de facto one-party state, effectively. People will quibble about the details, but that's the short version of it. And because the Indian government was on relatively good terms with, what was her name? Sheikh Hasina, I believe, was her name, the head of the Awami League. Since she was overthrown and kicked out of the country, there's a sense that the Indian government may have it in for the interim government and whatever new government is formed going forward. It's worth pointing out that Sheikh Hasina is literally just hanging out in India at this point, despite the Bangladeshi government asking for her to be extradited in order to, be executed. They originally wanted her to be extradited for the trial that they held of her regarding her complicity in the deaths of protesters during the mass protests that saw her overthrown. But that trial has since ended and judgment has been passed, and the judgment is that she's guilty and that she needs to be executed. So the Indian government doesn't really want to do that. It kind of doesn't want to set the precedent that if you work with India and then something happens to you, then India will just cut you off. They do want to kind of reward leaders in the region for being friendly. But that's coming at a cost right now, which is that they're on bad terms with the new government, which is undermining their influence in the country. So kind of a difficult catch-22 there for New Delhi. But it was never going to be the case that they were going to just intervene on the count of the mass protests and the deterioration in relations. Relations have not deteriorated all that much, and probably will never. Bangladesh just isn't really strong enough to confront India in that way, and India knows that if it tried to do that, it would probably just blow up in their face. Keep in mind, it was overbearing intervention of that style that resulted in the Pakistanis being ejected from Bangladesh in the first place. So I don't think there's really cause for concern of escalation here. I think the only real concern is the political situation in Bangladesh, which continues to feature an inordinate amount of mob violence. The mass protests have definitely been beneficial in some ways, in so much as they've opened the door to a reformist government. But whether or not they can kind of lock in those gains and deal with the deterioration in security in the country that has resulted from the overthrow of the government, that's kind of in question. Because it's entirely possible that they trade one-party rule for another. Because the main opposition to Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League was the Bangladesh National Party, BNP, as led by Khalida Zia, whom was basically another corrupt head of a patronage network in the same vein as Sheikh Hasina. And it's kind of broadly assumed that if and when new elections are held, that the BNP is going to inherit the country from the Awami League. And that's going to be a lateral move if ever there was one. Because, on culture war issues and other peripheral issues, there is a distinction between the BNP and the Awami League. They do differ a bit in those regards, but in terms of substance, substantively, there's no real difference. They are both basically just corrupt patronage networks. So if Bangladesh wants to take advantage of the opportunity presented by the removal of Sheikh Hasina and the decline of the Awami League, they really need some reformist candidates and parties to be successful in the new elections and assume positions of responsibility and power. There's been some traction on that. There have been some reformers who have moved forward. But a lot of the protesters and leaders of the mass protests have suffered from the vice of a lot of this era's mass movements, which is that they're overly decentralized. That gives them an advantage in terms of avoiding state coercion, state power, etc. But the downside is that they lack the ability to institutionalize their gains when they are made. And it could be that Bangladesh is in danger of failing to institutionalize the gains that have been made since Sheikh Hasina's overthrow, to the point where we could find ourselves, well, they could find themselves more accurately, in exactly the position they were in before Hasina was overthrown, just with a slightly different brand of de facto one-party rule. So all of that is an open question at this point. That's all stuff to kind of watch going forward. But unfortunately, one of the features of this sort of interim transitional period before the elections is that there is a fair amount of mob violence and instability. One of the things that happened when the Hasina government was overthrown is that the police were too afraid to kind of enforce the law to actually do so, because they have been complicit in the Hasina government's repressions in the face of the mass protests. And there was a sense that if the police didn't withdraw, then there would be reprisals from the new interim government. And so the result is that there has been some not inconsiderable violence in the country, albeit at a relatively low level. It has not been systematic. It's not as though the interim government is some kind of revolutionary government that is systematically targeting people. They've actually very studiously gone out of their way not to do that. But the lack of administrative capacity in Bangladesh combined with the shyness of the security forces in the wake of the revolution, well, not revolution, change in government, has meant that there's been more violence. And so hopefully that will change going forward. But that is what we're seeing right now in the form of these mass protests, and more specifically in terms of the lynching that occurred.
Seems so old school and barbaric to hear about that. Damn.
Well, it happens. It's not necessarily that uncommon in countries with weak rule of law and low administrative capacity. They just don't have the same capacity as other countries to enforce the law. And so people then are forced into a position where they either have to deal with elevated levels of crime or they take matters into their own hands and deal with it themselves. The latter can be effective, but of course, the problem with vigilante justice is always and forever that there's no due process. You never really know 100% for sure whether or not the guy the vigilante mob is going after is actually guilty. So, unfortunately, that's most likely what played out here in Bangladesh recently.
Hmm.
Anything else catch your eye?
Chet just mentioned they watched the movie Nuremberg, which is new. I think that's about the trials.
Somebody made another one, huh?
Seems so.
Huh. Haven't seen it. Does chat recommend it?
They say good movie.
Good movie. Yeah, I'll put it on my list.
It's not the same angle, but Oppenheimer was pretty good. Christopher Nolan. Sort of felt like a
I've heard.
scientist superhero movie. A lot of the big names of who made major advances in science were involved in that project in some capacity, or they refused to be involved in it. So just the name drops of like Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein and things like that are pretty cool to see.
How far into his life did the movie go?
There was a time skip. There was basically his involvement in the whole project until World War II itself and the use of the bombs, and then it sort of went to him getting blamed for things, and then time skips ahead into the future. So shouldn't be too many spoilers there, Chad, because this is in history. So
Yeah, it's a biopic. They tend to be a little predictable in that regard.
yeah, they make the
Well,
story compelling though.
did the movie cover the development of the hydrogen bomb at all?
I think it mentioned it because that was another potential angle. I think the Soviets were trying to do that.
Um, they did it after we did, because they were kind of behind us in those terms. But there was a big debate about whether or not it was worth it, or whether or not it was wise to develop the H bomb. Because you already had atomic bombs, so why do you need an even more powerful one? And as I recall, Oppenheimer was in opposition to their development.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a Hungarian scientist, Hungarian nuclear scientist, who was very much for it. And ultimately, he ended up kind of carrying the day and being given responsibility for developing the project. I think his name was Edward Teller. I just Googled it. I think that's the guy I'm thinking of here. Yeah, Teller was more of the mind that more powerful bombs were better because then there would be more deterrent.
Mm-hmm.
But his opponents were of the mind that creating super weapons that powerful just made the prospect of war, just made war in general even more destructive to the point where it could just wipe out civilization.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as it was, the Eisenhower administration was pretty hawkish, so they leaned towards deterrence through strength. Bigger, more powerful armies and weapons means more deterrence, so let's do that. Yeah, nuclear weapons were all the rage in the 50s. It was seen as a cost-saving measure. You don't need as large a military if you have lots of nuclear weapons, because if you go to war, you can just nuke the fuck out of the enemy until they're all dead.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed like a good idea at the time.
But what if we all do that? Well, then the Earth is destroyed and it's uninhabitable. Oh. That could be a problem.
Yeah, even after the Soviets got nuclear weapons, the United States maintained a pretty large lead in terms of their deployment and quality. So having lots of nuclear weapons and basically having a doctrine centered around them seemed more feasible in the 50s. But as the Soviets caught up, it became less feasible. Having a basically military centered around nuclear weapons becomes more risky when your opponent has them as well, because it means that there's greater risk of a general escalation in the use of nuclear weapons that could result in the annihilation of, well, civilization of your country, but also just sort of broader modern civilization in general, which is a problem for those interested and concerned and invested in civilization. So ultimately, after the 50s, they ended up walking back the nuclear weapons centered doctrines and started building up conventional forces again. I think it was actually the Kennedy administration that kind of initiated that. Yeah, it required some changes. A lot of the vehicles, aircraft and whatnot, were kind of designed to be nuclear bombers first. But then as American involvement in conflicts like Vietnam and whatnot in the 60s escalated, it became more and more apparent that America needed a lot of residual conventional capacity. You can't nuke your way out of every problem. Sometimes you're going to have to drop bombs and send in troops. So at that point, they started investing much more in conventional capacities.
What was the status of the doctrine in the Korean War? Because that sounds like it would be before that shift back to conventional troops.
So Korea actually happened before the shift towards nuclear weapons in the first place.
Oh.
Yeah, that was kind of a different time. The Korean War is remembered as a war of the 1950s, but keep in mind it actually started in 1950, which technically is the last year of the 1940s. And in terms of the context of the conflict, it really was more of a late 40s conflict, more than an early 50s one, even though it lasted into the 50s. Yeah, the United States, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, was doing what it had always done after big wars, which was demobilizing. There was not really a strong desire for the United States to maintain a large standing army after World War II. There was much more of a sense that with the new international institutions that the United States was sponsoring, specifically the United Nations, that peace would be an international responsibility that everybody would buy into and contribute to. And that with the recent destruction of World War II, that there would not be big demand amongst major powers for another big conflict. So there was a sense then that de-escalation and demobilization were necessary and desirable, and that's what they were up to. Huge amounts of equipment was mothballed, demobilized, even scrapped. And the American military presence in places like Japan and South Korea was pretty bare bones. There had been significant demobilization to the point that when the Korean War broke out, the United States actually had very few assets available to mobilize. They had garrison forces in Japan, but garrison duty in Japan was notorious for being very, very cushy. So the troops that were there were not even remotely combat ready. They were busy getting drunk and availing themselves of the local geishas. They were not preparing to fight a major war. And so the early American deployments to Korea to help the South Koreans were not especially effective for those reasons. It actually took a long time for the United States to basically remobilize its army and remobilize its defense industrial base in order to really contain the North Korean invasion. That's why it took so long for the United States and the UN more broadly to turn back the North Korean invasion. The North Koreans basically had their run of the peninsula in the early months of the war. And it was only, I think, like 4 months, maybe 5 months in, that the UN and the United States in particular were able to finally rally and actually start turning them back. It just took them that long to mobilize anything. And even after that, the effects of mobilizing the defense industrial base had pretty notable economic impacts. There was a lot of inflation in the United States in this period, stemming from big government spending on the war, because they were trying to mobilize so many assets so quickly. Interestingly, this also had the unintended side effect of rejuvenating the Japanese economy, because there were so many defense industrial assets that had been demobilized after the war that the United States government found it necessary to basically outsource some of the sourcing for equipment, munitions, supplies, and whatnot, to Japanese producers. And the result of that was a minor economic boom in Japan that really helped them pull out of the economic funk that they'd been in since the war ended. Yeah, tensions had been growing with the Soviets in the aftermath of World War II, but even by 1950, they hadn't really quite gotten to the point where it was thought to be necessary for the United States to maintain a permanent standing army. There had been shifts in that direction in the year or two leading up to Korea, but it was really Korea that was the big catalyst there. So after that, the United States basically, de facto, has had a permanent large standing army, which would have been virtually unthinkable in previous eras of American history. Yeah, the American impulse to demobilize its military was so strong that it kind of undermined NATO in the early going. The negotiations that led to the forming of NATO in the first place, the United States actually did not want to maintain standing forces in Europe at all. The plan for NATO originally was that if there was a war with the Soviets, then the United States would mobilize forces in the United States and then send them over to Europe. The Europeans obviously did not like that, because that would mean there were going to be probably several months at the beginning of such a conflict when the Soviets basically would just have their run of Central and Western Europe. The Europeans could hold them off for a while, but without American support, they probably wouldn't last that long. And weeks and months are a long time in a war, especially when you're talking about the distance between the Elbe River and the English Channel. It's not all that long in the grand scheme of things. So the Europeans insisted that the United States maintain a standing army in Europe in order to deter the Soviets. And the only way they could ultimately get the United States to make that concession is by agreeing to make a concession of their own, which is that the security commitment in Article 5 of NATO is actually softer than you might think. Because originally, that commitment had been ironclad. If the Europeans were attacked, then the United States would be legally obligated firmly to come to their aid. But in order to get the United States to commit to standing armies in Europe, the concession they had to make is to water down that language a little bit. So the language became such that the United States is not necessarily obligated to come to Europe's defense if they come under attack. Rather, the language is such that they have to basically consider taking action, which may or may not involve actually coming to their aid.
So I'm not saying you have to help us, you just have to think about it, okay?
Yeah, that's a little legal out for the United States there if they don't want to come to their aid. Now, this has never been an issue because the United States has always wanted to maintain the credibility of its promises in NATO, and so has taken Article 5 very seriously. So de facto, it is an ironclad commitment. But like a lot of things in diplomacy, it's not actually a legally binding commitment. It is more of an informal handshake type ironclad commitment. It's as tough as Washington wants it to be. And because Washington has always wanted it to be ironclad, it's always been an ironclad, tough commitment. But if that changes, if there were, say, a new government that didn't care as much, they would find it very easy to undermine NATO's credibility, basically just by signaling that they're going to interpret Article 5 by its looser interpretation, which is that while they are technically supposed to come to the aid of a member of NATO that is attacked, technically they don't have to. So the Trump administration has flirted with doing that, but they've never actually done it fully. They've teased that they would do it in order to gain leverage on other member states to get them to spend more on defense. But they seemingly have no serious plans to actually undermine the credibility of Article 5. And so this issue of Article 5's secret sponginess has never really come to the fore.
Yeah, I guess that's partly just, like you were saying, it's reputation management. People have wanted to maintain good relations with each other, so you honor the agreement even though you could technically get out of it. Because if you get out of it, you spare yourself the troops, but then you also tank your reputation with whoever was asking for your help.
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to... What was I talking about?
We talked about originally
Korea, right?
Yeah, Korean
That's
War.
what it was. Yeah, that was... I was trying to... I was explaining why that was more of a 40s war than a 50s war. Because it very much started in that period when the U.S. military was demobilized, was small, and where American commitment to containing the Soviet Union was still kind of in question. So much so that the North Koreans thought it would be a good idea to invade South Korea. So the Korean War was one of those catalyzing events that kind of snapped Washington out of that mindset. There had been others. The Soviet Union developing nuclear weapons was one. Czechoslovakia coming under communist governance was another one. That didn't really surprise anybody, but it was still shocking to a lot of people, a lot of regular people, so to speak. The common citizenry was not expecting that. And so they found that very distasteful. I think there was another one. I think the fall of China, in 49. That also shocked a lot of people. And keep in mind, a lot of people in the United States assumed implicitly, even though they didn't really have a lot of evidence, that the Soviets were secretly controlling communists in China. And to the point that China coming under the control of communists was seen as an expression of Soviet aggression, of Soviet expansionism. They believed that the only reason China had gone red is because the Soviets had willed it. So Czechoslovakia, China, and the Soviet nuclear weapon, all of those combined in 49, roughly, to really kind of shock the U.S. public into being more proactive in terms of confronting the Soviet Union. Things like the Berlin airlift as well were happening around this time. So tension was running relatively high, but there was still a lot of debate happening about what to do with it in this particular period, like 48, 49, 50. So that was the context that Korea happened in. So the doctrine of maintaining a large standing army, but then making it smaller than it would be otherwise by using nuclear weapons, that came out of this period. That was later. So that kind of defined the mid-late 50s and overlapped with Korea, but Korea predates it by a bit. And then it's more in the late 50s, early 60s that you start seeing the transition back to large conventional forces with less emphasis on nuclear weapons.
I heard a story about the Korean War regarding the actor Michael Caine. Apparently he served for England in the Korean War, and there was a situation where they're out in the cold in the winter, it's shitty, they're outnumbered, and they're getting surrounded by a contingent of, I think, Chinese and North Koreans. And they were going to give one last-ditch effort and we're just going to charge into them and try to surprise them and do what we can. And it was very bleak, and they assumed that they were probably going to die doing so. And when they charged at the Chinese and North Korean position, there was no one there because the Chinese and North Koreans were trying to flank them and go around the back. So they ended up just continuing to run, and they just ran away. And they're like, we're just going to leave. This is a good out here. We're outnumbered, so it's better to retreat if you can't win an engagement.
Yeah.
So not exactly like a war story where you just destroy a formation, but an epic escape is good too.
Yeah. Everything turned out better than expected.
Yep. Indeed.
That's pretty funny. Yeah, that big turnaround when the Chinese intervened was pretty dramatic. Yeah, the U.S. and Allied forces lost a lot of troops as a result. Big headlong retreat all the way past the 54th parallel. Wait, is it the 54th or the 45th? Oh, neither.
34th?
Is what I know. 38th.
38th. Damn, we got it on the fifth guess.
Yeah, that's still a big deal in China. The Chinese government for the past, 10 years or so, has been trying to play up the Korean War as this big patriotic conflict. It's been appearing in a lot of Chinese movies, media, TV, what have you. And the fact that the United States was like the main opponent is kind of relevant there. Since relations with the U.S. have deteriorated, there's been more, relatively speaking, anti-American media in China. Mm-hmm. And so Korean War dramas and war films are kind of an extension of that. It's pretty interesting. You very rarely see the Korean War depicted in film, especially in the United States. In the United States, it's actually known as the Forgotten War, partly for that reason. So it's interesting to see another country, specifically China, actually playing it up and making some big budget movies about it.
Did they do well? It seemed like it was ultimately a draw in the sense of the country was split and neither one got to...
It's interesting that you ask that question, because I actually had a conversation about this with some Chinese students back when I was in grad school. I knew them, mm-hmm. And so the topic just kind of came up organically. And so I sort of asked them what the impression of the Korean War was in China, and they said, "Oh yeah, we won."
Oh.
I said, "What? What do you mean you won?" It's like, yeah, we beat you. And so that led to an interesting, colorful back and forth. I kind of told them that the impression in the United States is that it was a draw, and they were pretty surprised by that. The Chinese perspective is that they were the underdogs, and the fact that they were able to achieve their objectives of preventing the United States from conquering the entire peninsula represents a significant victory. Yeah. And that's generally how it's still framed even today. Keep in mind, China had only just exited its civil war. The Chinese Civil War only ends in communist victory in 1949. And then the Korean War starts up about a year after that. And a year is not a long time after a fucking civil war, man. Mm. And keep in mind, the Chinese Civil War was just on top of the Sino-Japanese War, World War II. And then that happened and corresponded with an earlier iteration, basically, of the Civil War in the 30s, when the nationalists and the communists were fighting. And that corresponded with and followed the warlords period, when China was in an even bigger and more violent civil war between a whole myriad of different warlords. So this was a very violent period of China's history, the 1920s, 30s, 40s, especially. And no sooner does that period finally end than suddenly, surprise, it's not over. We have one more conflict we're going to squeeze in here. The Korean War. And oh, by the way, it's with the world's reigning superpower that just played a leading role in winning the most destructive war in the history of humanity. Good luck, guys. So they very much were still of the mindset that China was under siege, was the weaker party, was a colonized, tread upon country, and that they needed to stand up for themselves. And that's the framing for Korea. That's the war when China finally gets its shit together, stands up to the West, and wins. And they're not really wrong, right? Because before that, China was not unified, and they'd been kicked around by this, that, or the other imperial power. After the Civil War ends in '49, they do have a unified government. There is something resembling peace within the country for the first time in living memory, effectively. And in Korea, they do fight a modern Western power, in fact, the most powerful one, and don't lose, which is much more than can be said for virtually any other conflict China had waged against a Western power up until that point. So Korea is kind of a high watermark for China in this period of history. That's why they think they won.
It's a moral victory. I get it. They feel like they should have lost, so since they didn't lose and they got what we would consider to be a draw, that must be a win, because we should have been favored to win based on our reputation.
Well, also just overwhelming economic and material superiority. You know, the armies that China sent into Korea were undersupplied. Like, China was still kind of a mess in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. And so they just really didn't have the economic base they needed to maintain a large expeditionary force, even in their immediate vicinity. Like, even though Korea was neighboring them, like, fielding a big army like that and sustaining it over a long period of time was a pretty heavy lift economically for them. And the sorry state of their economy after the Civil War just made it all worse. So they didn't have enough ammunition, they didn't have enough guns, they had virtually no air support. Everything was very bare bones. You know, they were effectively fighting in the Korean War, especially in the early stages of their intervention, with the same armies that they had been fighting the Civil War with. You know, the communist armies that had fought the Kuomintang, and to a lesser, earlier degree, the Japanese during World War II. You know, those same sort of peasant guerrilla armies were the armies they were sending in to fight the United States and Korea. So yeah, that's not really a winning formula. And the only reason it worked for as long as it did is because they caught the West completely off guard. Everybody, especially MacArthur, you know, the general in charge of American and UN forces in Korea, assumed implicitly that the Chinese would never be bold enough to intervene against them and actually fight them. And so they were suffering from a great deal of complacency when the Chinese actually did intervene, and in a big way. And the result is that they were caught off guard and routed, just absolutely crushed by the initial invasion force the Chinese sent in. You know, they were undermanned, well, not undermanned, they were overmanned, if anything. The Chinese armies were undersupplied, but they made up for it with combat experience, maneuverability, and numbers. You know, all of those combined were lethal for the UN forces, because the UN forces were used to fighting with North Korean armies, which were poorly disciplined, poorly trained, also undersupplied. You know, the North Korean army was not like a first-rate force. So once the UN and the United States were able to kind of deploy modern armies in force onto the peninsula, they were able to roll up the North Koreans pretty quickly after that. But the Westerners themselves were not really top-notch. Like, the armies that the United States and the UN had in Korea were not as good as the ones that they had used during World War II, for example, just a few years before. Were not as well trained, and the forces were not that experienced. A lot of the guys that had fought in World War II had left the service. You know, they've been drummed out, retired, become civilians. Because of the demobilization I mentioned earlier, even a lot of the institutional knowledge that had been built up was lost, because so many officers and NCOs had left as part of the demobilization after World War II. So the American army kind of had to be rebuilt very quickly as a result of the Korean War. And by the time UN forces were getting close to the Yalu River in the north of North Korea, they still weren't at 100%. So, for example, to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, American forces were still largely road-bound at this stage of the conflict. You know, in World War II, roads were important, but you would venture far from them if you had to. in order to kind of get around enemy defenses, in order to flank formations, or to build defensive positions to prevent the enemy from doing those kinds of things. In Korea, that didn't really happen as much. American forces largely just stuck to the roads and then just pushed. And generally, the North Koreans were too badly organized and led to take advantage of the wide open flanks that tended to result from that. So by the time Western forces get to the Yalu River, not only are they poorly disciplined in terms of protecting their flanks, they're complacent because they think the war is almost over. So they've kind of stopped paying attention. So when the Chinese flood in, they take advantage of that. They're able to very quickly and easily completely surround a whole multitude of UN units, up to and including Kane's unit, the one the story you just talked about, but also a number of Marine units, for example. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir is legendary because of this. A Marine unit completely surrounded for a long period and having to fight its way out. And also, the difference in experience is worth mentioning here too, because the soldiers that China was sending in were largely veterans of the Civil War. They were guys who had been fighting for a long time. A lot of them had been fighting against the Kuomintang in the Civil War, fought against the Japanese, fought against maybe even some warlords if they were older. So even if they were under-equipped, they were battle-hardened. These were guys that had been through some serious shit, through one of the most violent periods in the history of China. And so they were tough. They were very good fighters. They struggled logistically, but when they went toe-to-toe with Western forces, they did well, especially in the opening stages here when they were able to take advantage of all of these problems and flaws that the U.S. Army was exhibiting. I would point out, too, that a lot of the tactics the Chinese were using were also reflective of tactics they had been using as guerrillas for a long time. Trying to take advantage of, trying to fight a superior army is something the communists had been doing for a long time to that point. So trying to infiltrate through hill country and forests to suddenly appear out of nowhere on a flank, for example, that was a tried and true tactic they had used against the Japanese and the Kuomintang for many years. Maintaining relatively poorly supplied light infantry that were large in numbers, but which could move very quickly and exploit weak points in an opponent's position. That was another feature of communist maneuvering during the Civil War and in earlier conflicts. So they were basically just doing more of what they had been doing for a long time. And the fact that it was so successful kind of speaks not only to the weakness and inexperience of Western armies that they were facing, but also to their own experience and proclivity in that type and style of warfare.
Yeah, that almost sounds Zerg-like in some ways, where you don't have as expensive and well-equipped units, but you have more of them, and they're more maneuverable, so you can try to get a surround of some kind.
Yeah, people generally remember Chinese forces in Korea for their human wave attacks. And that was certainly, used. That was a prominent feature. But less commented on is the fact that they were actually outmaneuvering Western units. It was not the case that they were just throwing men at the enemy and hoping for the best. They did actually put Western forces in very disadvantageous positions through superior maneuvering, and then launched the human wave attacks to maximum effectiveness. Yeah, it's kind of wild to think about how huge China is, and the fact that the West was at war with all of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a huge country. The fact that they didn't just steamroll the West and Korea really speaks to how weak China was after that period of conflict in the 20th century. Because they had hundreds of millions of people. They could have mobilized huge numbers of them and just swarmed the peninsula, but they just didn't have the ability to do that at that point.
Yeah, it's a big logistical challenge.
Yeah, there's a number of interesting Korean movies the Chinese have produced over the past 10 years. I can't remember their names, There was one that I thought was pretty cool that was actually a three, I don't want to say three-part. It was kind of, what's the word I want? Not an anthology almost. Basically, it told the same story from three different perspectives. So the movie had three different parts. And one of them was the perspective of the commander of a Chinese unit trying to cross a river. He was trying to build a river. That's what it was. So I think he was actually like a combat engineer. So his mission was to build a pontoon bridge across a major river so that Chinese units could cross and continue their offensive. The movie, I think, was set early on in the Chinese intervention. So that was the first part of the movie. Second part of the movie was actually from the perspective of an American pilot who was attacking the bridge. And then the third part of the movie was told from the perspective of a anti-air gun crew. It's like the crew of one of those big 40, 50 millimeter anti-aircraft guns that was used prominently at the time. Yeah, I've never really seen a movie quite like it. For one, I've never seen a movie that focused on combat from the perspective of an AA gun. That's just unheard of for me. Like, it's always, I've seen movies from the perspective of air crews, bombers, fighters, obviously from the perspective of infantrymen, from the perspective of generals and leaders. I don't think ever logistics, but certainly never an AA gun. That was very unusual. I thought that was really cool. That was really neat.
Mm.
Yeah, another feature of these Korean War movies in China is that it's not uncommon for there to be American characters in them, or for them to show parts of the story from an American perspective. And interestingly, they tend to be pretty respectful. They're generally not portraying the Americans as like bloodthirsty monsters out to like destroy and rape Korea, that kind of thing. It's actually relatively accurate in terms of its portrayal.
How come the Korean War wasn't as remembered as, say, the Vietnam War?
It was less controversial. There was more of a consensus in the public that it was necessary. Because again, at this time in history, the American public implicitly assumed that all communists and communist movements everywhere were under the explicit direction and control of the Soviet government. So when the North Koreans invaded South Korea, that was interpreted as an explicit example of Soviet expansionism. They believed it was the Soviets trying to expand their control to the entirety of the Korean peninsula. And it was seen as necessary then to contain that kind of aggression. So there was more public support for that aspect of it. But also, the war just kind of disappeared from the headlines after a while. In the first year, it was big news, and then progressively after that, it became less and less important as a news item, to the point where by the time the conflict ended, it was almost back-page news. People were just kind of tired of it and didn't really care about it too much. You can kind of see something similar with the American War on Terror, with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They were big headline news items when they started, but by the time they finished, hardly anybody was paying attention to them. Korea was very similar. Even when the war was still being fought, it was in the process of being forgotten. And part of the reason for that, too, in the 50s, especially like 52, 53, was that the war stagnated. So when the front line was moving rapidly, there was more to report on. But after the first year, the conflict stagnated for years. The front line barely moved at all. There was kind of a de facto stalemate, and most of the fighting was localized and involved trying to gain specific positions that gained leverage over negotiations that were pretty much ongoing for years on end after the first year. The negotiations could get hung up on like the dumbest of shit, like just individual hills even, would be argued over. And so, in order to improve negotiating leverage, there would be localized offensives to grab individual hills or other positions around these positions that were being argued over. So, that's not exciting stuff in the grand scheme of things. And so, for that reason, journalists paid less attention, and in turn, it kind of left the public eye after a while. Yeah, the Korean War just kind of petered out. It was not controversial enough for people to argue about it, and it wasn't going well or badly enough for people to be paying close attention to it. It just kind of stagnated, withered in the public imagination, and then eventually died when the peace agreement was finally negotiated. Vietnam, by contrast, was hugely controversial politically. And even though there wasn't a front line, the absence of a front line just meant that the war was more ambiguous. And so people were more swayed by whatever news items came out. Like the Tet Offensive was a big deal. There was no front line to look at and say, hey, the communists have seized all of this territory. In fact, after the Tet Offensive, the communists were largely contained. The Tet Offensive was a kind of military disaster for the NVA and the Viet Cong. But politically speaking, it was a disaster for the United States, because the American public had been told in the lead up to the Tet Offensive that the war was nearing victory, that the NVA were on the run, and that we were on a path to an end to the conflict. And then the Tet Offensive happened, and that whole narrative is just blown up. So from the perspective of the American public, there was a sense that the government had been lying and that they were basically just stuck in a forever war trying to prop up what was broadly seen at the time as a corrupt South Vietnamese government. So the political controversy of the Vietnam War, the growing peace movement, the sense that the war was not going especially well, all of that made Vietnam a much more attractive topic in terms of news items. It was almost always front and center in the news while the conflict was ongoing, in a way that was not the case for the Korean War.
Which one did we throw more resources at?
Oh, definitely Vietnam. Yeah, Korea was a stretch, was a heavy lift economically, mostly just in the first year or two, because the United States had to pump a whole shit ton of money in a very short amount of time into its defense industrial complex. And that created disruptions in the overall economy that actually resulted in inflation. But after that, things kind of evened out, and it wasn't as big a deal. Vietnam, by contrast, did not require probably as intensive an amount of funding in a given year as Korea did, but Vietnam lasted so much longer than Korea that the total amount spent added up over time. So Vietnam ended up being, in total sums, more expensive than Korea. I believe that's the case. Let me throw out the usual disclaimer in a more timely fashion this time. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in foreign policy and economics, so if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. And we do appreciate the feedback we get on here. But that said, my impression is that my understanding is that the Vietnam War is the more expensive war of the two.
I see. More expensive, more controversial, more buzz. The math checks out.
Yeah, more bombs were dropped during the Vietnam War than were dropped during the entirety of World War II by all sides combined. It was a pretty prolific bombing campaign on the part of the United States in Vietnam.
Damn.
Those B-52s can do a lot of damage.
Mm-hmm.
And fighting an insurgency with B-52s, mind you, is going to be pretty cost inefficient. That's very much in the neighborhood of trying to kill a bug with a sledgehammer. Like, you can do it, it'll work, but it's not very efficient.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the U.S. government knew that the Viet Cong in the south were being resupplied via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. which ran through Laos and Cambodia. And they didn't really want to just send the military into those countries because that would be very controversial. So instead, they tried to inhibit the operation of the Ho Chi Minh Trail by bombing the fuck out of it. They dropped a massive amount of bombs on the Ho Chi Minh Trail over the course of the war, like truly prodigious. Laos is actually technically the most bombed country in the history on account of the bombing campaign that the United States launched targeting the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. And despite that, didn't really work. All of that expense, all of that damage, and they still only really managed to inhibit it a little bit. Like, there's only so much you can do from the air to stop dudes walking through jungle.
Yeah.
Some of the more advanced parts of the trail did have roads, so there actually were sometimes trucks and vehicles moving along it. But even there, the damage was mitigated. Like, the Vietnamese had all kinds of ways to avoid it. You know, they could camouflage roads, they had alternative paths. Sometimes they would have advanced notification of a bombing raid, and so that they could, you know, get their stuff away from the roads, basically. And any damage done to roads could be rebuilt in relatively short order on account of combat engineers that the Vietnamese had in the area. Yeah, it's the kind of problem you really need ground forces to resolve. It's not something you're going to bomb your way into a solution for. But the US tried anyway, because that was seen as more politically palatable. Yeah, special forces were relatively more successful in that. I have read accounts that American special forces operations targeting the Ho Chi Minh Trail did have more of an effect. The issue is that there just weren't that many American special forces. So there was kind of a cap as to how disruptive they could really be. How are we doing on time?
Going for hour 45.
Hour 45. The time really flies.
Yeah. We got some good tangents and questions that led us to longer discussion, which is fun.
Let's see. Oh, was there anything else you wanted to get to?
I didn't see if we had questions, but Fuzzy Chord's around taking them, so there might be some.
Yeah, I think we've had some residual ones. Yeah, there was the NVIDIA Palantir power couple team-up question. I don't really have anything to add to that. I don't think it's all that. I think it's just a sign of the times. You know, just basically the AI snowball continuing on as it has been. But I don't think there's any special significance to that beyond it. I don't think Palantir is realistically going to do much that they were not already doing as a result of this deal. Let's see. Oh, Fuzzy Chord. I missed Fuzzy Chord's question last time. We just kind of ended up wrapping up before we got to it. I watched a video about the AI bubble. It talked about the large and obfuscated debt AI companies have taken on, how they are expecting and may already be receiving a government bailout, and how nearly all U.S. economic growth in 2025 has been in the AI sector. How do you see this bubble playing out? Big kaboom, slow fizzle, or something else? I mean, it's too big to just fizzle out, realistically speaking. But I don't know that it necessarily ends in a big kaboom either. I think people who point out that these companies are almost certainly never going to turn enough of a profit to cover all of these costs that are being incurred on their behalf by investors. But that said, keep in mind the tech sector shows that a major company, you know, a big, well-capitalized company, no less, can kind of just linger on without turning a profit for a very long period of time. Like, I don't think Facebook turns a profit even now, even after all of these years. And there's other examples in the tech sector of companies like that. So it may be that AI companies end up exhibiting a similar pattern. It may be that they never really turn a profit. Certainly not one large enough to justify all of the investment that they received, but it may be that they kind of continue on without losing the confidence of investors, because there's a sense that even if they can't turn a big profit, the data that they generate and process represents a kind of wealth asset in and of itself. And that so long as they can produce that and build it, the company will kind of maintain its value. That's really what props up Facebook. It's nobody really thinks that they're going to turn a huge profit anytime soon. But the company is able to has a lot of value invested in its data. So many people use Facebook and generate data for advertisers that it represents in and of itself a substantive asset that can be traded on. And so that's the more important aspect of Facebook's valuation than profit. And that in turn is what keeps their stock price relatively high, despite them not actually turning much of a profit, which is the traditional barometer of what constitutes a successful business. IT companies could evolve into something like that, basically. And in that case, they could basically avoid a major collapse that would shake the foundations of the Western economy, completely undermining much of the economic gains that have been made over the past 10 to 20 years. An AI bubble bursting would be a big deal. It will probably burst to some degree, but it may not be a complete disaster, as some have predicted for the reasons that I've outlined. But we'll see. And I'm not an expert in AI, at all. When I read about the economy, I'm generally more interested in things like trade or public policy. The AI bubble and the technology kind of behind it is not something I've read enough about to really give a confident opinion. So I have to caveat my answer here pretty significantly for that reason. Let's see. And then a question for today. What are estimates for Laotian casualties from the bombing? And how was Laos's relationship with Vietnam, China, and the US after the war? I don't know if we have exact numbers for how many died as a result of the bombings. It's kind of hard to say, because at the same time the US was bombing Laos, Laos was actually in the middle of a civil war. The royal government was fighting communists, both Laotian communists and also Vietnamese communists who were moving through the country without the government's permission. And so the civil war was probably killing more people, one would assume, than the bombing itself. But the bombing did generate a significant amount of casualties, just in absolute terms. So it's difficult, if not impossible, to quantify and parse the casualties from one of those causes from the other. I think the overall casualties in Laos from this period of conflict top 1 million, which was a good chunk of the population at the time. But again, ascribing portions of that 1 million to one or the other cause, like American bombing, I think that's not really possible entirely. At least several 100,000, one would assume, one would think. But I've seen some people who have made the argument for closer to 1 million, which would make the US disproportionately responsible for most of the casualties in this period. But that seems unlikely given the violence on the ground between different competing factions. So I'm inclined to assume something around 250,000, let's say. And mind you, that's not just casualties from the bombing itself. That's not just people dying because a bomb fell on their head. That also includes people dying from causes downstream of the bombing. In other words, the bombing destroyed a lot of infrastructure and created problems for the local economy in eastern Laos that resulted in food shortages and other economic difficulties that contributed to a death rate that was higher than it had been before the war and before the bombing campaign. So there's a little bit of accounting juggling going on there. How much, how do you want to count the casualties? Do you want to count just the ones that died because of bombing, or do you want to count the ones that died because of bombing and then because of the disruptions that were caused by the bombings? The latter number is obviously going to be much higher than the former number, and it's generally the latter number that is used when people talk about this. So as far as estimates for Laotian casualties from the bombing, not entirely sure, probably a couple 100K, depending on how you want to define casualties. How was Laos's relationship with Vietnam, China, and the US after the war? Well, with the US, not great. They pretty much joined the communist bloc in the Cold War after that, and so that pretty significantly inhibited diplomatic relations. Relations with China, not great as well. That kind of ties into Vietnam. Relations with Vietnam were very good. Basically, Vietnam had backed the Laotian communists in the civil war in Laos and were effectively Vietnamese proxies. So when the civil war resulted in communist victory in Laos, that was basically a victory for Vietnam. They de facto controlled Laos vicariously through the Laos Communist Party. That's not to say the Laotians did not have some degree of sovereignty. It's not as though the Laotian communists were under the direct control of the Vietnamese communists. But the Vietnamese wielded significant influence. I don't know how familiar people are with the demographics of Indochina, but Vietnam was easily the most populous country in the region. Laos and Cambodia had way, way smaller populations. And in turn, that translated into a significant amount of influence for both the North Vietnamese government and the South Vietnamese government in the broader regional conflict that was playing out at the time. They could both kind of throw their weight around, and there really wasn't much the Cambodian and Laotian governments could do about it because they were just so much smaller in terms of demographic and economic resources. So when your proxy takes over a neighboring country, generally your relations with the new government are going to be pretty good, and that was the case between Laos and Vietnam. However, Vietnam's relationship with China deteriorated pretty rapidly over the course of the closing stages of the Vietnam War, and especially after the Vietnam War ended, culminating in the 1979 invasion of Vietnam by China. So correspondingly, because Laos was so interconnected with Vietnam to the point of basically being a proxy of Vietnam, when Vietnam broke fully from China and aligned with the Soviet Union in the Sino-Soviet split, Laos was basically dragged along for the ride. And in turn, Laos's relations with China suffered accordingly. Not to the point China ever invaded Laos, but diplomatic ties were a little bit tense correspondingly. And it wasn't really until after the Cold War ended when relations were kind of repaired fully. And since then, obviously, Laos has benefited greatly from the recovery and ascendancy of China's economy. Not all of those ties, economic ties, are great. Some of that comes in the form of tourism, which can be a little shady in the region, tends to be controlled by organized crime. But there are a lot of Chinese tourists that have come to Laos, either just for the scenery or to visit one of the big resorts that has been set up just across the border, and which tend to host a significant amount of gambling, prostitution, and drugs. Like I said, it tends to be a little skeevy.
But
there's also
Speaking of organized crime, I saw a funny thing regarding the IRS in the United States. If you earn money through theft or through any illegal activity, you're obligated to pay taxes on that. The IRS apparently does not report you if you're selling drugs and then reporting your income and paying them. They're not responsible to then talk to the police necessarily. So people were joking about how it says on the IRS website that if you make money illegally or through bribes, did you receive a bribe? That's taxable income. Just funny because you wouldn't really think that people who are committing crimes are going to be honorable with their taxes, but they might as well put it on there. Maybe they get paid.
I'll have to keep that in mind.
Fair enough.
Well, let's see. I guess in the time that we have left, I want to squeeze in just some end of the year stuff.
Sure.
The hits and misses that I mentioned last time, and then a little forecasting. So we'll knock that out, and then we can kind of progress from there. If I can find the right notes. Here we go. Did we talk about sub-Saharan Africa last time?
I don't think so.
I was talking about some overlooked stories.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I apologize if I'm being redundant, but I'm going to go through it. Hopefully not too boring. So the civil war in Sudan is definitely, I think, an overlooked story. People have talked about it intermittently, but by and large, it's been overshadowed by some of the bigger drama going on in the region. Israel and Gaza being, probably the leading example. But yeah, in this past year, the Battle of Khartoum ended, which was the major battle for the control of the capital of Sudan. The government forces won that battle. The rebels were ejected. In the west of the country, in the rebel stronghold province of Darfur, there was a town called El Bashir that had been under siege for more than a year. And that siege finally ended just in the past few months. And the result was pretty gruesome. There was a massacre as the rebels moved into the town and basically killed the men and raped the women, sort of medieval style. And any number of human rights abuses in other places as well, but El Bashir was particularly notable because of the sheer scale of the violence. And at this point, the conflict is mostly focused in the south of Sudan, in a set of provinces called North Kordofan and South Kordofan. Kordofan as a whole is a region that is known as the breadbasket of Sudan. And so it's a desirable conquest for both factions. You can kind of get a supply of food if you control it. But the government has shown some momentum. They've taken back a good chunk of territory, including the capital, most notably. But on the other hand, the rebels have been getting more support from their international backers, especially the Emiratis. And right now, the rebels are kind of angling to take control of all of the territory in Darfur, including the last government holdouts, in order to position themselves to potentially obtain independence and have their own country that would be broken off from the rest of Sudan. Too early yet to see if that'll work, but that seems to be what they're aiming for as far as strategy at this point. They are no longer trying to take control of the entire country. Let's see, we haven't talked about Ethiopia in a while. There's been a lot of violence there. There has just been kind of an escalating trend of ethnic violence in Ethiopia over the past 20 years. There's never been a sharp increase per se, just kind of a persistently low boil that kind of gets worse over time. And to the point that the government is pretty consistently having to engage in internal security operations of one kind or another to chase after ethno-nationalist militias and terrorist groups in the country. They've been relatively successful in doing that over the past couple years, but obviously the big war in Tigray was a big setback. Since the war in Tigray ended, which we talked about a fair bit when it happened, since then, violence has kind of returned to the northwest of Ethiopia. Not in Tigray, though. Tigray has been relatively well behaved, although there has been some skirmishing between the more recalcitrant members of the Tigray militias the government had been fighting back in 2020. But the main focus of fighting now in Ethiopia is actually in Amhara state. the state of Amhara neighbors Tigray and had mobilized militias that fought with the government against the Tigrayan militias in the Tigray War. So one would think they would be on pretty good terms with the government. But after the Tigray War ended, the Amharan militias felt that they were not given their due in the peace negotiations. They felt they should have been given more as reward for helping the government and for fighting the Tigrayan militias. And so the result of that has been that some of the more aggressive Amhara militias have actually started fighting the government in order to pressure the government to give them more concessions, basically. And the government has responded very strongly to that with a significant escalation in government violence within Amhara in order to try to contain the militias. And there's been a lot of stories about human rights abuses coming out of that backlash from the government. There's a really sad story the BBC had about a woman who had been targeted for violence and rape by some government forces that were looking for rebels in her village. And I remember she had the memorable quote. What was it? It was, I may actually have it somewhere in my notes. Something to the effect of, quote, "It is repulsive to be born a woman," end quote. And she said that because being in a traditional culture, it's really important for a woman to not have sex before marriage in order to have decent marriage prospects. And marriage is really important in traditional societies out there because for a lot of women, that's your livelihood. That's how you secure your future. So if that's locked out, if you can't do that because you end up having sex before marriage, that puts you at not insignificant risk. You're basically going to be dependent on family, or you're going to really have to settle for a really substandard, probably violent husband, or prostitution, in which case you're probably going to die young. Such is the difficulty and danger of prostitution in a lot of developing countries. And, customs and norms in places like this are such that it really doesn't matter if you willingly lost your virginity or not. So, what matters to them is whether or not you had sex before marriage, yes or no. Whether you were raped or not doesn't really matter to them. And so this woman basically was making the point in the article.
Your voice cut out. Cut off. He's still in the channel. So apparently I think only has 2 bases. It's 2 mutas. We have the sound of silence. He may have crashed. Agent Smith? Yep, I bet he crashed. I think he just texted us. It's a silent film of Zerg versus Zerg. I think I have a pretty big lead with my upgrades. I have +2, +1 now. Let's attack him to get this. Did he crash? He said he crashed. He'll be back. He's on his way. Very good. Alright, chat. Ideas, topics. You messaged him. Good. Yeet. Okay. Is it going to switch back to mutas? This is some crazy shit. Okay, we can just get a small squad to do that, and then we'll go attack. Let's go attack. And there's a heckin' drop as well. The reinforcement units go fight this. The main army goes this way. They're just being silly now. Let's see what their army is like. What's your actual army like? Oh, sick bios. They force a base race, huh? Transfuse is out. I have a backup roach warren too, so. Oops. I think this is on Singapore server as well, so we get nice high ping macro practice. How many workers they made? Okay, well, we lost the fight at home. Got 2-2. Nicely done. Played. So they went muta into roaches. What server was this? This is a crazy lag. Ah, Brazil. Brazil server. In ZVZ, known who scream. Indeed. Time to build that new PC. I think he has 2 parts left. At least last time I asked. The case and the motherboard, I think. Brazil isn't getting worse, it seems like. You mean in like current events and news, or the ping to the server? I'm pretty far from Brazil. No RAM he did. No, he's getting RAM. The parts that he still needs to get. Smith, you muted. On today's episode of Computer Crashed or Muted. $650 APM. What do they have on rapid fire? Cyril has like 2,000 APM at the start of the game. Because he's doing like a shift queue mine on his workers. You're going to sell your RAM in 5 years and buy a private island. What would you do there? A private island sounds really bougie and fancy, and in a sense it is. But then you create the logistical challenge of getting stuff there. Are you going to live there? What are you going to do there? Because if you live there, you need to get supplies there. You also ideally want to have electricity there. Which, how are you going to manage that? Generators? Because you can't be on a grid. Why would you rent it to someone who's a supervillain? You could rent it to a more well-intentioned rich person. Host an annual Zerg versus Zerg. They're 40-9 against Terran. Nice. Someone's alt account. Good shit, good shit. LARP ZVZ. If you were gonna LARP ZVZ, what would be your... What unit would you roleplay as? Hydra's pretty good. There was a really good Hydra cosplay at one of the BlizzCons. The Infestor? Larva, you would just flop around on the ground? Overmind? My viewer count stayed the same through Dota 2 and StarCraft 2. It's wobbled a decent bit today. We got up to, I think, 170 viewers streaming Dota. And then it got to 200 during World Discussion. How come I don't play Dota anymore? Thank you for the blessing. Uncle Infested. You're going to be the Overmind, just a big circular eye thing. A bunch of tendrils. Wobbly viewers are the most loyal. You're not wrong. I have a now substantial block of viewers who are Dota tolerators, who are here for me, the vibes, and the music, and the community. And if Dota is on, they'll hang out, but they don't really follow the game. I play safe lane as my primary, position 1. A question for when he comes back. Finland, Estonia. I see. I see. You're an Invoker spammer? Nice. I want to try him, but at the first time you play him, it's kind of sus. You're basically going to lose an unranked game. Or 10. I had an Invoker support in one of my games when I was farming Yorkies today. Position 4. And he was good. He was very good. He was applying pressure with his auto attacks. He was casting a lot of different spells to suit the situation. Good shit, good shit. Invoker game. Does this like drill you the different stuff? Huh. There's a contingent that's only here for the cat. We do get a cat jam or cool cat emoji from Guacamole almost every time he shows up. It is a running skit or segment of the stream when I take a step away break and the cat takes the chair. We have to negotiate who gets the chair. It's basically heated seats to him. That's what he sees it as. I'm assuming this will be with Banes. I can't really morph Banes that fast, so we'll get Link Speed and then a Bane Nest. Okay, Queen, you go to a good spot. You eject. I'm assuming they're going to try to send Banes at me. Let's just check over here. Oh, that's Link Speed, okay. This queen can trade really efficiently here, which is good. Any little trades like this are pretty nice. I have more here. Sick control, dude. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, Bane Nest is cooking. It's almost done. I have a spine up there. So if they decide to backstab, I have some defense. Need to make sure I'm not super stacked up in case they have defensive Banes. Let's make some bombas for offense. And then go be aggressive. Look at all these safety Banes. They have so much safety. Nice. They're letting me do this. What? Oh my gosh, they must have crashed like Agent Smith. Alas. It was a clean game. CatCam win is plus 10 viewers. I have a push-up camera I could get another camera for Cat. Or I could use push-up camera for that, but I don't have enough webcams for both of those things. How did I queue into a 4.2? Nani? Well, they made an exciting game by cheesing. I respect it. Learning mid-lane matchups is the hardest part. I feel like the fundamentals of mid, though, are really important. Survival, classic. Invoke 10 spells as fast as you can. Invoke and execute as many combos as you can in 30 seconds. As many 3x combos. That's like 3 different spells back to back to back. Combo. Play without submitting scores. Start game, press enter. Invoker game. I don't need to do this right now because I'm in SC2, but I could do it once and see what it's like. Oops. Press enter. Oh, this tells me to cast what? Oh, Ghost Walk and then Sunstrike. Okay. QQW, invoke. How do I cast it? And then I cast Sunstrike. That's EEE. Oh, this is cool. Invoke and cast Ghost Walk. And then EMP. And then I FD. Oh, this is cool. You reached 2 combos. New record. D and F are cast. It's easy to fat finger the spells until you get muscle memory for them. Yeah. This is cool. You can just do it with the keyboard. You don't need to click anything. Tornado is WWQ. Invoke. Ice Wall is QQE. And then FD. Deafening Blast. And then FD. Alacrity is WE. Forge Spirit. Chaos Meteor is EW. I don't know what these are yet, so everything's slow. It's fine.
What did I miss?
Someone asked you a question about... let me just read it for you. Have there been any big political changes in Finland, Estonia, etc., given the current movements in the Russian-Ukrainian war? I feel like there was a big talk about them at the beginning of the war and have been forgotten.
Well, obviously, the big change with Finland was joining NATO.
Mm-hmm.
I think since then they've mostly been focusing on incorporating their military into NATO's command structure and overall planning, which is going to take a while.
Yeah, and they have the best StarCraft player in the world, so they can have him as the commander.
Well, I don't know about that, but yeah, that is sort of what they're focusing on. I haven't heard as much from the Baltics. I think the big thing there was the agreement for Germany in particular, but also other NATO member states, to deploy and maintain a couple of units in the Baltics. It had been the norm that NATO did not maintain military units in its eastern members. Obviously, those members could have their own militaries, but as a general rule, NATO troops, such as they were generally not deployed there. And that was partly just to save money, but also to kind of appease Moscow, since they didn't really want to end up in a position where Moscow felt threatened. Didn't really work.
Felt threatened anyway.
But after 2014, rather, there was a sense that there needed to be more done as far as building up military infrastructure and military units in NATO's eastern members in order to act as a deterrent to potential future Russian aggression. And so there were negotiations about it, and there have been intermittently here and there little bases that have been constructed and little deployments set up. Nothing especially large. They're still not really like the equivalent of a Ramstein or something like that in Eastern Europe, as far as like really large military bases hosting forces from outside of the hosting nation. But in the Baltic states, I can't remember which one exactly, but there was one particular Baltic state that is going to host a rotating NATO unit on its territory going forward. Right now, I think it's German. No, the Germans are going to maintain a permanent presence. That's what I remember, but they're going to rotate out the units that are deployed there. So I don't think there's like a single unit in the German military that will be permanently stationed in this particular Baltic state. And NATO has similar arrangements with other member states. So the forces that will be forward deployed in the Baltic states are not really going to be large enough in and of themselves to defeat a Russian invasion if the Russians were really serious about it and launched like a full-scale invasion. But they will be a deterrent. Basically, NATO is signaling here that it is going to defend its member states, even if they're in somewhat vulnerable positions, as the Baltic states are. And that if the Russians attack, they can expect a response and a full-scale conflict for control of the states in question. I don't think I've heard anything about politics in the Baltic states, so I can't really comment on that. I think last I checked, Harmony was still the biggest party in Latvia, but they were not in power because all of the other opposition parties grouped together to form a coalition, pretty much specifically designed to keep them out. Harmony, for those who don't know, is basically an ethnic Russian party in Latvia. Latvia has a pretty large population of ethnic Russians because of the city of Riga, which was a major port in the Soviet Union and so attracted a great deal of migration from outside Latvia. The result being that Riga today has a significant minority of ethnic Russians. I don't think it's quite a majority anymore, but a significant minority Russian population. Basically, the further away from Riga you get, as I understand it, generally the more Latvian things get. And pretty quickly at that. So a lot of Russians in Latvia vote for Harmony to kind of represent their interests. And the rest of the country is a little bit paranoid about that, because there's still a little bit of suspicion that ethnic Russians in the country are more sympathetic to Russia than they are to the Latvian state that was created after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's more justified with some members of Harmony than others. There are some that are pretty explicitly Russophile, but others are kind of genuinely invested in the success of the Latvian state. Regardless, a not insignificant amount of political tension in Latvia just kind of stems from Harmony and suspicion about its motives. Hence the coalition of parties designed to keep Harmony out of power.
So Harmony is the biggest party, but the coalition of the opposition is greater than them.
Correct.
I see.
Yeah, Estonia is even more quiet than Latvia. They don't have a significant Russian minority like Latvia does. Although I think they do have like 2 provinces in their east that are majority Russian. But I can't remember the last time I heard anything about Estonian politics. Lithuania is a little easier. Lithuania is basically just mini-me Poland. Very similar in terms of political culture. Yeah, so Lithuania right now, I believe, has a right-wing government. Relatively populist in outlook, but unlike a lot of populist parties in Europe, they're actually very pro-NATO and anti-Russian, just owing to the country's history, basically. But I don't think there's been any big political changes, as far as I know, in the Baltics over the past year. Yeah, the easy way to remember the Baltics, at least as far as their politics, economy, orientation, etc. Basically, Estonia has more in common with Finland. So you can almost see Estonia as a borderline extension of Scandinavia. Finland itself is not really Scandinavian, but there's a lot of Scandinavian influence on Finland. So Estonia is a similar case study. Lithuania, again, sort of a miniature Poland. They have a lot in common historically. Very different languages and ethnicities, but in terms of common history, very strong linkages there. And Latvia is kind of distinct in that it has such a large ethnic Russian population. So their native population is a little bit crowded out on that count. As a result, they don't have as independent an identity as Estonia and Lithuania. I think they also differ by religion, if I remember correctly. So Lithuania, like Poland, is Catholic. Estonia is mostly, like Scandinavia, Protestant. And then Latvia is kind of a mix of a whole bunch of different things, including Eastern Orthodox on account of the Russian population. That said, I have to caveat that by pointing out that while this is a generally accurate portrayal of the dominant religions in the Baltic states, most people are actually atheists in all three countries. So religion has not really fully recovered from the era of Soviet domination in that sense. There has been some resurgence, and the pre-Soviet religions are largely the ones that have recovered in so much as they have, but by and large, most people did end up becoming atheistic over the course of Soviet rule, and that largely still defines the religious culture of the Baltic states. At least the last time I checked, anyway.
And it was that the Soviets felt like people should have the state as their source of admiration and focus rather than the church.
They would not have framed it quite like that, because that implies that they're kind of substituting one church for another. And you could make the argument they were implicitly doing that, but that's not how they thought of it. They thought of themselves as secular humanist rationalists. And for such people, religion just doesn't really have any place at all in your daily life. So their perspective is that religion was, and well, is, since people like that are still around, just raw superstition that has no place in a modern rational world. So the Soviet perspective is that religion was something to be phased out, and that they were being tolerant by allowing it to continue to exist at all in any capacity. So they were not replacing religion. For them, they were just getting rid of it.
Mm-hmm. I see.
So pretty much the same thing, but slightly different framing, basically. Well, hopefully that answer was satisfying. Shall we return to the horrifying story of the Ethiopian woman?
Sure.
Sure. Well, I think you kind of got the gist of it. Basically, her life is kind of ruined now on account of the sexual assault.
Mm-hmm.
But the article in particular kind of quoted her on that. Like, she's very self-aware of that, and she was lamenting the fact that women have such a terrible position in countries like hers, where, well, she pointed out specifically, this is what I was kind of driving at. You know, if she had been a man, they would have beaten her up, maybe stolen some of her stuff, but she would have otherwise been fine. Like, her life would have just continued on as before. But because she's a woman, you have the added stigma of sexual assault, which basically undermines all of her prospects.
Mm-hmm.
And she pointed that out very specifically in the article, and how unfair that was and how terrible it was to have to deal with that as a woman. So that's an example of the type of violence that's happening in Amhara province in Ethiopia. There's also been some tension between Ethiopia and Eritrea, but I think that's been a little bit overblown. People keep talking about it, but nothing ever really happens. And Eritrea really isn't in much of a position to go picking a fight with Ethiopia anyway. They might engage in some skirmishing, maybe clandestine, that's not the right word, maybe secretly support some of the militias fighting the government in Ethiopia, but I don't think there's going to be much room for escalation beyond that, given just how much weaker Eritrea is.
Is Eritrea touching Djibouti?
It is, actually.
Nice.
Djibouti is just to the east of Eritrea.
How is Djibouti?
You guys keep asking, and the answer is always the same. Like, it's fairly stable. They've got the one strongman president who just kind of hangs on to power in perpetuity. But nobody really makes too big a deal out of it. And he has strong ties and backing from France. And the international community kind of funnels money into him in order to kind of pay him to host all of the international missions that operate out of Djibouti. Almost all of the anti-piracy missions in the region are kind of headquartered in Djibouti. So that provides a nice stream of revenue for the government that helps kind of prop up the government, even in the face of endemic corruption and various other abuses.
Would you say that means that pirates have the mantra, live by the booty, die by the booty?
I would not, but not a bad joke.
Thank you.
Yeah, most of the pirates actually operate more out of Somalia. So not so much by Djibouti.
Well, I mean by booty as in plunder.
Fair point. In that case, yes.
Okay. Glad we could clear that
Point conceded. Well, let's see. There was a... what would you call it? There was a failed attempt to resolve the conflict between Rwanda and Congo. The Trump administration anyway, famously intervened in that and sort of sponsored a peace deal. It will probably not surprise you to know that ceasefire that was agreed has since unwound, and that fighting, albeit sort of low level and intermittent, has resumed in eastern Congo. And it was another one of those bizarre episodes that occurs involving the Trump administration internationally. They kind of parachute into a conflict, try to resolve it. There's a paper-thin agreement that is made. Trump administration leaves, and then things just kind of return to the status quo ante after they've been gone for a week or two. So Congo and Rwanda seems to be another example of that. Let's see, I can skip some of this. I don't think people are really all that invested in Guinea. Oh, I forgot to finish with Eritrea. So Eritrea and the Ethiopian government actually had pretty good relations coming out of the Tigray War, because the Eritreans had actually fought on the side of the Ethiopian government. They actually helped the Ethiopian government put down the militias they were fighting. However, much like the Amhara militias, the Eritrean government did not feel like it was properly rewarded for their assistance. And so there's been some skirmishing along the border with Ethiopia, and some talk about the Eritreans potentially pressuring the Ethiopian government by sending supplies and other forms of support to the militias fighting the Ethiopian government. So that's why there's been talk about rising tensions in the region. The Tigray War is kind of the gift that keeps giving, in that sense.
Very happening. Not necessarily a good thing, but...
Let's see, just to kind of wrap up with the overlooked stories. Cuba's had a whole bunch of power outages this year. Their power network has kind of been on the fritz, increasingly so over the past couple of years. There have been multiple times that they've just had to reboot it from scratch, basically, after it failed completely. So the economic crisis in Cuba continues apace, in other words. That's just one symptom, the most obvious one that can't really be ignored. And in Guyana, oil exploitation finally began in earnest this year. About 10 years ago, they found reserves off their coast, but it takes a long time to build up the infrastructure to exploit that and export it. And this is the year they finally really started exporting enough to make the government significant amounts of money. I don't think it's going to turn into a fully blooded petro state, but it is going to be an important source of revenue for the government going forward. And let's see, in the United States, a couple of trends. Some of this is stuff we've talked about, and this crowd listening probably is familiar with this stuff, so it's not really overlooked in that sense. But the broader public maybe isn't especially dialed into these stories. So for one, private equity in the United States has been in decline this year, if not also in the previous year. That's a pretty dramatic change. Private equity has been a major economic driver for the US for much of the past 10 to 20 years. So that's a notable change. The tech sector is still reeling. There were big layoffs a year or two ago, sort of in the wake of the economic recovery from the pandemic. That's still kind of an ongoing process. I don't think the layoffs are as big as they used to be, but hiring hasn't really picked up yet. And so the industry is not really quite in the same place it was just even a couple of years ago. And markets have started to pull back a little from AI investments, which has resulted in a sort of big boom in talk about whether the bubble is about to collapse. Some of which we've seen manifested here with people asking about it. So, sort of the genesis of that conversation was markets themselves getting a little more skeptical about the prospects for AI as a technology and as an investment. Let's see, we could probably just skip hits and misses. It's mostly just intuitive stuff.
One of the funnier stories this year was the huge AI company that was getting tons of investment, and then they found out it was just a bunch of normal Indian coders who just go yell into the office, okay, make it so! It's like, it's not AI, it's just another office.
Yeah, everybody loved that story. Just kind of confirmed all of their worst assumptions of the AI industry as being riven with scams.
Yep.
Well, we could do a little forecasting for 2026. What can we look forward to in the new year, other than more 2020s style drama? Well, do you remember KUSMA? That was the trade agreement that the Trump administration replaced NAFTA with back in his first term.
Mm-hmm.
So that was always designed with a sunset provision that would require either its extension or renegotiation in 2026. Well, here we are. And as it happens, fate has ordained that Trump is going to be in office for that renegotiation, which was not really originally expected. So we can look forward to a return to the drama seen in his first term about NAFTA, only this time it's going to be KUSMA. I don't doubt that the Trump administration is going to take the opportunity to make some big revisions, especially considering how unencumbered, shall we say, this iteration of the Trump administration is compared to the first term Trump administration. So I don't doubt that there's going to be some fireworks with that. Although, if he does outsource responsibility for the renegotiation to Scott Bessent, it might not be as bad as all that. So ultimately, it's going to come down to how much Trump involves himself in the process and just what ambitions the administration is going to harbor towards this renegotiation. We shall see. You will definitely be reading about it in the news. Supreme Court rulings. I kind of expected the one on tariffs already this year, but apparently we're not going to get it until next year. And of course, there's also the Supreme Court case regarding, what was it, Section 5 of the Civil Rights Act. That'll be another big ticket item. So that'll all be 2026. And there's also going to be a change of leadership at the Federal Reserve in the United States. Powell's term is going to end. That means Trump is going to have to appoint somebody new. There's going to be a bunch of drama when it happens about whether or not the Federal Reserve will be able to maintain its independence. And if markets don't have confidence that it will retain its independence, you will definitely be reading about the fallout in the news. That has the potential to be very dramatic. There are a couple leading contenders right now. One of them is a guy named Hassett, the other one a guy named Warsh. There are a couple other minor figures, but they're not really expected to be likely winners of the sweepstakes here. Hassett is apparently a pundit, at least currently. He goes on TV and basically just defends the administration. That has led markets to disfavor him. They see him as a kind of yes man who will just do whatever Trump wants, which is not what they're looking for as far as maintaining the independence of the Fed. The other guy is a guy named Warsh. He actually was in the running to be the head of the Federal Reserve back in the first term of the Trump administration, 10 some years ago when Janet Yellen was replaced. And he ultimately did not win out because he was seen as overly deferential to Trump. People back then, too, were concerned about the independence of the Federal Reserve. And so the nod went to Powell instead because he was seen as more independent. Well, Warsh is back now. And even though he's still seen as overly deferential to Trump, he is seen as less deferential than Hassett. And so he is now the market's preferred candidate, from what I was reading. It's also suspected that he might be more likely to maintain the independence of the Federal Reserve once he actually gets the job, if he gets it, because he is seen as being extremely ambitious. Basically, one of the things that resulted in him not getting the position the last go-around is that he was seen as basically trying a little too hard to get the position, to the point it was thought that maybe he was actually lying about some of the stuff that he was promising to do once he got the position. Now, at the time, back in 2017 or so, that was seen as disqualifying because it seemed to confirm the market's suspicion that he was overly deferential to Trump. But now everybody in the running is seen as overly deferential to Trump. So now Warsh is preferred because he is seen as being so ambitious that he might actually be lying about being overly deferential to Trump. And so markets are hoping that if and when he receives the nod and becomes head of the Fed, that will be the case. Basically, that fears about him being, that him subjugating the Fed to Trump's will come to naught because he basically just wanted the job and lied to Trump about doing what he says. That is the market's best case scenario at this point. And you can see how dire circumstances are by how shit a situation that is. That is not a great set of choices to choose from. Institutional rot continues apace in the United States. So that'll be some more drama for 2026 to look forward to. That's all US stuff. That's going to impact the rest of the world, but it centers the US. There will be elections in a number of countries next year, so you'll see drama around each of these. In the first quarter, there's going to be elections in Bangladesh. We already discussed that before. We'll see whether it goes for the BNP or maybe some kind of reformist coalition. Thailand is going to have elections in February. We'll see whether or not the right-wing government that took power after the break with Thaksin is able to hold on. I'm a little skeptical, but we'll see. Let's see, in March, DR Congo is going to have presidential elections. Not really a lot of broader international significance to that one, so that well may come and go unnoticed by the broader international community. Let's see, and also in the first quarter, in March and May, Colombia will have parliamentary and presidential elections. You can look forward to drama regarding the Trump administration trying to interfere in those elections. I don't doubt they'll try to do what they did in Honduras already, in Colombia. Okay, second quarter 26 in May, Lebanon will have elections. It'll be interesting to see how Hezbollah does in these. Hezbollah is normally a major player, but they're under a lot of pressure these days. from both the Lebanese government and the international community, and of course Israel. So whatever degree that Hezbollah has been undermined to should become manifest in this election. It'll be an interesting signpost in that regard. And then also in the second quarter in June, Ethiopia will have elections. As you can guess from the earlier conversation about Ethiopia, that'll be really interesting to watch, because it's going to basically be a referendum on the Abiy administration that is in control of Ethiopia at the moment. Lots of reasons not to like the administration, given all of the violence, but the alternatives are basically ultra-violent ethno-nationalist parties, which is not going to be great for the unity of the country. So this may be a case of no real alternative, resulting in the return of the incumbent candidate. I don't have anything scheduled for. I don't have anything on my list for elections in the third quarter of 2026. So you guys may get a respite for that. I think that'll be around the time of. Well, no, I think the Olympics are going to be sooner than that, right? That'll be like January, February. Yeah. So quarter three will be blissfully empty of internationally significant elections, at least as far as I know. But then the fourth quarter is going to make up for that absence with a whole litany of them. Bosnia is going to have elections. That'll be a kind of referendum on the EU-appointed governor, who is not very popular at the moment. Could be some fireworks from that, but if there are, it'll probably be localized to the Balkans. Midterm elections in the United States, that'll be a big one. I think everybody knows there's going to be a lot of dumb drama around that. American elections only ever seem to get more expensive and more theatrical. So the internet is probably going to effectively shut down while it's inundated with election-related content. My apologies to the rest of the world on that. Also in November, Bulgaria will have presidential elections. Be interesting to see how that shakes out, given all of the drama recently with the conservative government having to resign. So we'll see if the opposition can kind of solidify the gains that they've made. Let's see, Brazil has elections in October. Lula had been polling pretty badly, but I was reading today that he's actually had something of a comeback. Not so much due to a surge in his own popularity, but more to a collapse in the popularity of the Bolsonaro-aligned right, which is in shambles effectively at the moment because Bolsonaro's been arrested. There's not really a consensus on who should succeed him, and there's some, as always, scandals undermining them. Pretty much everybody's undermined by scandals in Brazilian politics, so it almost doesn't matter because it's a kind of constant variable. But the expectation at this point is that Lula will win because the right is just disorganized and weak at the moment. So you may actually see a fourth Lula da Silva term in Brazil, as wild as that sounds.
Not because he's strong, because the opposition is weak.
And then in December, there's going to be an election in South Sudan. I think the thing to watch here is whether or not it happens at all, because the country at the moment is kind of on the verge of civil war, if it isn't in one in practical terms already. So if it is, and it escalates, then there may not really be much of an election in December. It may not even really be technically possible. So a couple of things to look forward to in 2026. Not an all-encompassing list. There's definitely going to be other stuff. But this is just some things I thought of and some things I tripped over the course of my reading over the past couple weeks.
Cool. We've been doing this segment for 9 years-ish. Pretty awesome.
God, has it been that long already?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, it's a long time to prepare a podcast, isn't it?
Yeah. It is indeed.
Maybe I'll get the Patreon running someday.
Thanks for all your hard work. Well, people ask about it a lot, so you do have at least a starter market from the people who follow you from here.
Yeah, I would I could just set it up, but if I do, I want to have some kind of regularly scheduled content that I would release. I don't want to just beg for money.
It could be
I mean,
something really simple, like it doesn't have to be extensive for the regular uploads. Like I would say, even if you did a shorthand text summary of your notes for the week, that would be really cool, just so people could kind of follow what you've been browsing, what you've been learning, kind of similar to the weekly news update that you do for some people in email. If you literally just copy pasted that with like a note or two about each thing, that would be cool. It would save people a lot of time. I know that's one of the common questions that we've gotten over the years is, where do you get your news and what are some sources that you would consider to be reputable? And that always has the follow-up response of, well, every news source has a bias, so you have to factor that in, but this is where you get your stuff.
I actually stopped sending those emails.
Really? When?
Probably early this year, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's not. I didn't get the impression anybody was really reading them.
Mm-hmm.
It was a pretty short list, and a lot of them, a couple of them were just ex-girlfriends of you and Michael.
Mm.
I don't think they're all that interested still. Yeah, so I figured might as well just wrap it up.
Well, if there's interest in the chat, let us know. Because I think that's a cool format for people who are actively seeking news. I definitely rely on you to give me the live update on Sundays, so I'm saving myself time there, seeing what Agent Smith has for me. It's been fun being with my family here in South Dakota because I get to check in with my family, especially my dad. I would say he's probably the most politically motivated person in my immediate family. So just kind of asking him what stood out to him throughout the week is basically a tradition now. And that's where I'm sourcing some of my questions for you. And it's pretty cool because I respect his position. He's more of a traditional conservative. He's not a MAGA Republican or anything. So his stance is refreshing compared to a lot of the rage bait media, because it's either you're pro MAGA or you're anti, and those are both very loud demographics, but there's a lot of nuance on either side for people who aren't really into the rage baiting stuff and they just have their core issues that they care about and they're able to formulate their own opinion on things. So this week he was talking about, I think, our relationship with Iran and how the US and Israel have been talking about potentially getting aggressive over there. And my dad isn't really in favor of adventurism without reason. Like, he's all for it if we get attacked, playing back at someone makes sense, but to just kind of assert your aggression on the map is not something that we need to be doing, especially like the piracy in the Atlantic Ocean, taking oil rigs and stuff. It's a very throwback to privateer era where you have a government mandate to capture some stuff, which is basically sanctioned piracy.
Yeah, Trump unfortunately does have a predilection for theatrics.
Mm-hmm.
But on the upside, that also means that he's not really that interested or serious about actual conflicts.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even with like the Iran-Israel conflict, the U.S. largely stayed out. Washington pretty much restricted itself just to providing logistical information and defense support to Israel over the course of that conflict. You know, shooting down Iranian rockets, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But other than a few airstrikes, I don't think the U.S. participation was all that extensive.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot of our involvement further from home ends up being a lot of intelligence sharing, where we're helping people solve their own problems, but not necessarily projecting our own force.
Yeah, that pretty much is the American package at this point. If you're willing to do the fighting on the ground, then we'll give you intelligence, supplies, and air support.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty much what we were doing in Afghanistan in the latter half of that war. More or less what we're planning to do in the case of conflict in Europe, if NATO actually does need us. I don't know how many land forces we would really be rushing over there in that case. It's a cost-efficient package for the United States. But it's not necessarily enough, as we saw in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. There kind of comes a point when you pretty much have to have boots on the ground if you want a very particular outcome. And if you're not willing to do that, then you're kind of implicitly leaving the fate of the conflict in the hands of what few ground forces your allies are posting, who may or may not be willing to go the full mile and actually be able to persevere against whoever you're fighting together.
Yeah, that's the long game, is not just your ability to win the first engagements or to present superior weaponry for the first key battles. You have to find people who are going to stay there long term. They need to live there, and they need to still be basically fighting for whatever causes you were trying to lay down or whatever regime you're trying to help set up. And that's something that's kind of long term out of your hands, especially if it's not your people and your culture and you're not wanting to keep all your troops there for a while, because as soon as you pull out, there's going to be a snapback to whatever hegemon was in the region before. Like the Taliban taking over as soon as we moved out was, I think, a good example of that. We were able to establish certain norms and practices, but as soon as the troops leave, then they're just going to kind of fall back to whoever else has power in the region and wants to actually stay there.
Well put.
Did we talk about the recent Chinese military exercise around Taiwan?
We did last time, I think. Somebody kind of asked in passing. I don't really have anything new to report on it. They're just kind of mad about the United States. Well, maybe we didn't talk about it last time. No, I think I was talking about a different thing. Basically, anytime anything happens that upsets the Chinese government vis-a-vis Taiwan, then they will indulge in some kind of provocative military war games in and around Taiwan. That's become a routine part of their management of the Taiwan issue. So I think a couple months ago, actually probably less than that, they were agitated about, I think, something the president of Taiwan said. I don't remember exactly. So they had war games, and then people complained about it, and then people were asking about escalation in the Taiwan Strait. I think more recently, the U.S. just passed an NDAA, which is basically the military budget for the next year. And part of that budget involved a fairly significant sum of money that was allocated as military aid to Taiwan. And Beijing didn't like that. So, war games around Taiwan, more of the same. It's not really an escalation, it's just kind of routine at this point. They're voicing their displeasure in a way that doesn't involve kinetic operations, nor does it commit them to a course of escalation. It is basically just performative war games.
We're not going to attack you, but we're going to aggressively practice attacking stuff right next to your house.
Yeah, and that's not really anything they haven't done, virtually every year since the communists won power in China. They've always had war games like this, but they never really had a navy until recently that was capable of blockading Taiwan. And generally, war games in the past were not as provocative because they did not pose as credible a threat, unlike the Chinese military now. So those two factors combined mean that the international community pays more attention to these war games than they have in the past. And China has escalated their intensity more so than in the past. There's always been some naval war games near Taiwan, but never this close. And they were never quite so obviously practicing what an actual naval blockade would look like. So that's a very clear signal on the part of Beijing. But the Taiwanese government doesn't really take it all that seriously. It's not that credible a threat. I don't think anybody on the island or in various intelligence communities around the world really expect that the Chinese government seriously wants to invade Taiwan in the short term. This is more about managing domestic political blowback within China. Because whenever the Chinese government fails to do something in response to a perceived foreign affront to Chinese sovereignty, especially with regard to Taiwan, then nationalists within China bitch about the government. They're very unhappy about it, and they demand that the government do something about it. So to get ahead of that, the Chinese government is in the habit now of being proactive about, quote unquote, retaliating to these perceived affronts of one kind or another. And it's, again, just a matter of routine. It's not like a serious threat. There isn't any real potential here for substantive escalation. It's always possible it could happen, but the risk is perceived as pretty low. So I wouldn't worry too much about it.
Let's see. More posturing than actual projection of force.
Very common in international affairs.
It's cheaper. A lot cheaper.
Very much so.
Cool.
Well, do you got a little bit of a backlog with the Trump highlight reel, but there's virtually nothing of importance in it. It's just kind of a catalog of stuff that he's done. There's a couple breaches of norms to be had, but it's nothing that will surprise anybody. It's just kind of part of a broader trend of institutional rot. So we can save that for some later date, or we can skip it. Wait, that's the same thing. We can save it for a later date, or we can blow through it. Up to you.
Well, we filled the 3 hours, so we could probably save it for next time. Which will be our first episode of 2026.
God, will it? Is it already? Yeah, I guess it is, isn't it?
Sure
It is
is.
New Year's. Wednesday.
Yeah.
Wow. Time flies. 2026.
Are you going to party?
I'm going to party in my room by myself on my computer.
Let's go. What
I'm
games?
sure there will be much gooning and gaming.
Valid. What games have you been playing recently?
Just mostly stuff I got on sale recently, either Black Friday or in the winter sale. I think I told you before that I've been playing through Songs of Six, giving that a try. I'm actually still playing through Disco Elysium. I started that a couple weeks ago. That's a lot of fun. I think this week I actually started up No Man's Sky.
Oh, yeah.
I wasn't planning on buying it, but I saw it on sale. And I've heard very good reviews about its more recent incarnation, so I figured I could give it a shot. And I've been pretty pleased with it.
Nice.
I don't know if I'll stick with it long term, but I can see how I might come back to it in the future. It is basically kind of Minecraft in space, or at least that's my experience with it thus far.
Yeah, that's like one of the greatest redemption stories of a video game that colossally failed to launch, at least living up to expectations, but then their work after the fact ended up surprising people. It was actually a good game all of a sudden.
Yeah, I would concur. It feels like, I remember the original criticism was that it was barren. There's nothing to do. But playing it now, it definitely feels like there's a lot to do. And they've really kind of nailed sort of the feeling of exploration. I feel like that's a strong suit for the game. So it's been very engaging. I don't know if I'll stick it out for the long term, but yeah.
Well, you mentioned getting KOTOR. The feeling of exploration is really good in that game compared to other Star Wars games because it's set in the distant past compared to the movies. So everything is brand new. Like the planets, some of them you've heard of before, but the governing bodies on the planets are quite different from what they end up being in the movie era. Like Korriban, the planet of the Sith still exist. It's a ethnicity. It's an actual people. They ended up going extinct later on, but they're still kind of in full force there, and the Republic is in charge of a lot of planets. So it feels like more of an even split of galactic control compared to the movies where the Empire's basically taken over, and it's the story of the rebels trying to retake control. But this is a a time period where there are lots of Jedi, lots of Sith, and it's more of a 50-50 split of who's in charge, which makes your character's story more impactful for the outcome, which is a pretty fun vantage point. But you get that like ancient alien spooky tech feeling in the KOTOR games, where you're going to worlds and you're fighting tech that's even older than the Old Republic, and it's all totally fresh for people who have only seen the movies. Speaking of, one of the games I'm most excited about is the new Old Republic project that they're going to be working on. I think probably not till 2027 would we see an actual game, but it's using the same game director who made Knights of the Old Republic, which you got, and the second one.
The old extended universe persists against the wishes of Disney.
Hell yeah. It's the best part of Star Wars. Fight me. Disney, your stuff is not that good. KOTOR universe, way better. Chat, press 2 if you agree. Gotta be some people who agree with that.
See, that kind of makes me feel old, too, because I still think of the prequel extended universe stuff as being relatively new. Because a lot of that wasn't really developed until the prequel movies started coming out. And by then, I was pretty invested in the extended universe literature, which almost entirely took place after Return of the Jedi.
Yeah. So this is old era, like way before Obi-Wan.
Yeah, Sith Empire.
Yeah. Which is cool. I think it's like a couple thousand years before then.
Yeah, man, the Old Republic's history is crazy deep. There's so much there.
I don't know if you remember, but Kukio and I played that a ton when we lived in Canada. We were playing
I
the
remember him
MMO
having
version.
it up on his computer while I was there.
Yep. That, I think, was probably the best time that we had together in terms of personal freedom, and that area in Canada was pretty sweet. Surrey, next to Vancouver. It's like you're enough out of the city that it's not super expensive, but you have access to a bunch of really good food.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
We had a bunch of random Punjabi people who lived there, so they had really good restaurants and stuff around.
Yeah, Michael and I went to a really good Indian fusion place while we were there. Someday I'll go back.
Hell yeah. Well, with an American passport, you can go for 6 months, I think. Actually, maybe just a driver's license.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to cross over. You never know with the current administration, though. There's always some kind of drama lurking around the corner.
They were very skeptical and suspicious of us crossing the border, though, with 2 vehicles and a trailer all full of stuff. And they're like, how long are you going to be here? And we're like, 6 months. And they're like, really? You're not bringing anything sus, are you? No, totally not. We're just innocent Americans who want to play video games and stay inside in a rainy place and go out for food once a week.
Vancouver.
Yep.
Very cool place. Yeah, the prequel era is still pretty new to me. The new Disney canon basically just tried to scrap all of it, but the prequel stuff seems to have survived for the most part. Disney seems most interested in overwriting the extended universe stuff that happened after Return of the Jedi. Don't entirely know why that is, but yeah, that particular era that you're familiar with, that seems relatively untouched. So consider yourself lucky.
Yeah.
I do not get the benefit of that.
Untouched.
X-Wing series overwritten. The Thrawn trilogy overwritten. Just all of it.
Oh, no.
Very tragic if you're a Star Wars nerd.
Yeah, and that's the other plus side of, if they are not setting their sights on it, then they also can't pollute it with their bad ideas. The KOTOR story is still a good story. KOTOR 2 story is still a good story. I think they had to cut that one a little bit short near the end of the game, so there's maybe not as complete of a conclusion as they could have reached, but both the games are really fun. Really cool time period. I like how it also elevates characters who are not Jedi to be very effective fighters too. So you've got a lot of different character types. You can have droids, you can have there's a Mandalorian character in that who's really awesome. I think he's maybe the best fleshed out Mandalorian character before they made the Mandalorian movie, because they have Boba Fett and Jango Fett, but they don't really get too much into Mandalorian culture in those things. They're kind of people with cool sets of armor, and their backstory is mostly mysterious. But in Knights of the Republic, there's one of the main companions that you can have who is Mandalorian. You can ask him about it. He just like tells you stories and stuff. It's really cool. I like hearing war stories from characters. So anytime you can talk to an NPC and they just give you tons of lore of there was this battle and these ships were involved and there were this many casualties and I was doing this, and it's pretty cool. Good game, recommend.
I look forward to it.
Well, cool. Well, nice session as usual, and thank you for another full year of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Hope your PC building and setup is coming along well. Looking forward to seeing that test drove later when it's good to go. I think you said you had like the case and one other thing left to get.
Yeah, the case and the motherboard.
Nice, I remember correctly then.
And I'm being very deliberate, so it'll probably be sometime in January or February before that project completes.
Cool. Well, if it saves you a couple $100, I fully support that. You did not have a time deadline for this project. Fortunately. Thank you, chat, so much for supporting us doing this segment. Thank you, Fuzzy Cord, for landing questions. Agent Smith, for your time. And we'll see you all in the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah. Thanks again for having me. Always a privilege. Talk to you next year.
GG!